Trump nomination is a Biden win and a Kamala Harris presidency.
Nikki Haley giving remarks to her campaign headquarters tonight in New Hampshire after losing in the New Hampshire primary to Donald Trump. Now, how much has she lost by? What is the margin going to look like here? What will that do in terms of bragging rights and the case that she's making that she's not getting out of the race no matter what the political class says? Let's go to Steve Kornacki for some of the metrics on this. Steve, what's it looking like in terms of the overall performance here?
Yes, you can see we're close to 30% of the voting statewide now, and Trump's lead is now 12.5 points with what's been counted. And a couple keys to this here. First of all, all of Concord is in. We showed you that earlier. These are the three biggest cities. Concord's number 3, Manchester's number 1. And you can see here now we're up to 80% in Manchester. And the margin for Trump, it's been climbing a little bit each time we've looked. It's sitting at 15 points in the state's largest city. And again, this was one where if this was going to be basically a toss-up statewide, it would be a toss-up in Manchester. So I think that's a gauge here of, Haley's night here in terms of how far she's falling short of making this a real game statewide. She probably needs to be about 49% here. She's missing by 7. Trump's going 7 points over. That works in both directions. Nashua, which closed at 8, is the second largest city, and this is one on paper that Haley wants to be winning, and she really wants to be winning it right now to get that Trump margin as low as she can get it. And 60% in, she's losing it by 7 points to Donald Trump. Now, there is more to come. We'll see. We've seen, there can be variance between these precincts and these wards, so we'll see in the rest of Nashua which parts come in and if it elevates her. But she really needs to make up ground in population centers like Nashua right now to cut this lead down. A big source of votes for Haley, we can almost guarantee, still to be reported out, is going to be right here in Hanover, Dartmouth College, Donald Trump's worst town in 2016. It won't be a huge number of votes, but Haley, we are expecting, is going to get the vast majority of those. That'll help her cause. So will the city of Lebanon south of it. We expect she'll do very well there. We're also still waiting on Durham, Collegetown University in New Hampshire. For that matter, we're waiting on Exeter. These are places where Haley can run up numbers, and she needs to run up numbers because the problem for Haley, we started to see this early in the night, and I can tell you it has only continued, and it is a continuation of what we saw in Iowa. When you get away from these population centers, when you get away from some of these suburban areas, places with higher concentrations of college degrees, places with higher median incomes, she's significantly underperforming what we thought she needed to do to be in the game statewide. So again, you add that together right now, and it is adding up to a 13-point Trump lead. And I don't think it's at all impossible from this vantage point. I mean, we will see, but if you look at these numbers, it's not impossible. Trump's going to still win this thing by more than 10 points, by double digits. Yeah. And in that sense, if that were to happen, and that's an if, I'm just saying that is a possibility right now. You think back to what Haley just did. I mean, that was the Bill Clinton strategy in '92. The exit poll showed a toss-up in '92. The early return showed a toss-up. Clinton ran downstairs, called himself the comeback kid, and then 6 hours later they counted up the outlying areas, and he lost by almost 10 points in 1992. But nobody remembered that. They remembered early in the night. So I think that might have been the Haley playbook. We'll see again these final returns. There is a chance she can keep this in single digits, maybe on the higher end. But I think what really stands out here and what really tells a story, and I think might explain some of that rural and small-town weakness that she's having, is this. We showed this at the beginning of the night. There is a very large number, of independents and even, relatively speaking, Democrats. But look at this breakdown. Okay, first of all, this is the current breakdown. 49% of the electorate calls themselves Republicans, 45% independent, 6% Democratic. Again, these are numbers you're not going to see in other states. But check this out. Among Republicans, Donald Trump is beating Nikki Haley by essentially 50 points, 74 to 25. Among independent voters, Haley is beating Trump by 24 points, 61 to 37. That is a swing of 73 points between how Donald Trump is doing with Republicans and how he's doing with independents. And take it one step further, among Democrats, the 6% who call themselves Democrats, it is Haley 84 and Trump 6%. Wow. So that is, to rely on that kind of I can't imagine. I'll put it this way. The previous record that I'm aware of for a difference between the independent vote and the Republican vote in the New Hampshire primary was back in 2000. John McCain won the independent vote by 42. George W. Bush won the Republican vote by 1. That's a 43-point swing. Now we're talking a 73-point swing. Yeah. So the idea that this is a great result for Haley that gives her new life and everything, the core problem of her candidacy has been appeal within the Republican Party. And she's running at 25%. That core problem has not been addressed at all here in New Hampshire. She's just benefiting from a uniquely, massively high number of non-Republicans. And to take this one step further, if we start talking about the states that are coming next, obviously South Carolina is the next state where they're both going to be on the ballot. So South Carolina does not have party registration, okay? So you ask everybody, anybody can participate. Theoretically, every Democrat in the state, if they don't vote in the Democratic primary, could go and vote in the Republican primary. So it's a fair game for everybody to participate. But we always ask in the exit poll in South Carolina, what do you think of yourself as? Do you think of yourself as a Republican, as an independent, as a Democrat? Now, the highest non-Republican mix we've seen in a South Carolina primary was 40%. That was 31% independent and 9% self-identified Democrat. That was in 2000. When John McCain won New Hampshire with all of those independents, okay, and John McCain still lost South Carolina by 12 points to George W. Bush. If you applied the results I just showed you, Trump's strength with Republicans, Haley's with independents and with Democrats, if you applied them to that 2000 demographic mix in South Carolina, the most non-Republican they've ever had, Trump would win the state by 15 points. Right. So that is, again, Haley, we'll see how strong the result ends up being for her. Now we're at 30% and it's 13 points. But just thinking of South Carolina and then thinking beyond, because what happens beyond South Carolina when you get to Super Tuesday and the big massive states, they're not necessarily or on paper winner take all, but in a two-person race, which is what this is, they functionally are. Because those states, a lot of them have rules that basically say every congressional district, there's 3 delegates. If you get 50%, you win them all. Well, in a two-person race, you can basically get 50. Yes. Someone's going to get 50%. And so if Trump is winning these states even by small margins, he could very easily sweep the congressional districts. And then they have the same rule statewide. Hit 50% statewide, get all the delegates. So functionally, a lot of these states, Michigan is, most of the votes are given out. If you get 50% in a congressional district, you win them all. It's about 3/4 of the delegates in Michigan. California, you hit 50% statewide, you take them all. Texas, 50% in a congressional district, you take them all. 50% statewide for the at-large, you take them all. Alabama, go on and on. It is designed, the Republican process, for a quick resolution. And the added thing this year is that the Trump forces, since 2020, have really taken control of some of these state party organizations and in some cases changed the rules. California, which I just cited, that's a rule change. That was a rule change implemented by the Trump forces with this exact scenario in mind, where if you get to California and it's still a game, how do you get that big pot of delegates? Well, you change it and you just need 50% plus one statewide, you get them all.
Yeah, and that's why it helps to have an experienced political operation who is working the delegate game from the very beginning, before even the first votes are cast. I know this is going to seem a little bit strange, but if it's possible, control room, can we look at the Democratic primary results? We had a projection as soon as the polls closed in New Hampshire that President Joe Biden would win. The unusual thing here, well, there's a number of unusual things. One is that there aren't 10 delegates that are being awarded on the basis of these results in the New Hampshire Democratic primary. This is a symbolic primary only. But the other part of it that's important here is that Joe Biden wasn't on the ballot. And so for him to win, for him to even compete in New Hampshire, he had to be written in by people who were not seeing his name on a sheet of paper that had 21 other people listed on it, including 2 people who campaigned really hard in New Hampshire. Mr. Phillips, his name is Dean. And Ms. Williamson, her name is Marianne. Yes, nailed it. You can see the results there. Again, this is only 12% in. With a lot of write-in vote, you would expect that this would take some time to get there. But no question as to whether or not President Joe Biden has won this purely meaningless beauty contest in the state of New Hampshire. Let's bring in our colleague Jen Psaki, who knows President Biden, who is a former very important part of the Biden administration and its White House communications team. Jen is in Manchester this evening in New Hampshire. Jen, are we hearing anything interesting or substantive from President Biden's side tonight?
I mean, we are. I mean, there are statements flying out from the Biden team tonight. None of them have anything to do with the outcome in New Hampshire tonight. I'm sure they're relieved of what the outcome was on some level, but they're ready to move forward, basically. So, Rachel, a couple statements, one from the campaign out tonight, which indicates to me that they are moving to the general election. Whether Nikki Haley is staying in or not, they are moving on to the race against Donald Trump. And let me read you just two of the key sentences that stuck out to me. The first is, tonight's results confirm Donald Trump has all but locked up the GOP nomination, and the election-denying, anti-freedom MAGA movement has completed its takeover of the Republican Party. Lots of messaging in there, obviously, but they're saying we're running against him. The last line of the statement is, one thing is increasingly clear today. Donald Trump is headed straight into a general election matchup where he'll face the only person to have ever beaten him at the ballot box, Joe Biden. So the race is on for them. They're moving to the general election, whether or not Haley stays in. The other statement that came out from the White House tonight, Rachel, was from the president, and this was about news that leaked earlier this evening. My hunch here is this was not their intention for this news to get out today, which is that Jen O'Malley-Dillon and Mike Donnellan, two very close advisors to the president within the inner circle, are moving from the White House to Delaware to help play senior roles on the campaign. So lots of news, lots of reaction, none involving the New Hampshire outcome.
Well, but involving the New Hampshire outcome on the Republican side. I mean, Jen,
that's true.
I mean, we're very focused tonight on Nikki Haley's prospects and how tight or distant the margin is going to be between her and Donald Trump. Steve Kornacki just laid out to us some very brutal numbers in terms of how poorly she did with self-identified Republicans who are voting in the Republican primary. And so the places she's getting numbers from tonight in New Hampshire are from people who self-identify as Democrats and people who self-identify as independents. And those, of course, are the people who the Biden campaign is trying to mobilize in the general election to support President Biden's reelection. So, I mean, it's just New Hampshire. It's just this electorate. It's just this one contest. But here's everybody who's sort of Biden-inclined or potentially Biden-curious saying, like, we're going to get out and vote for Nikki Haley, even though it's awkward and we need to change our registration and do all this stuff and it's not really our peeps. And here's the Biden campaign saying, Nikki Haley is nothing. We are pretending she is not there. We know we are running against Trump. Nikki Haley's prospects mean nothing to us. So there is a little bit of a cross purpose here for people who like Joe Biden and people who are trying to elect Joe Biden at his campaign HQ.
Yes, and look, those Biden curious, Haley curious, Biden curious people are key to them. I mean, if you look at these numbers that Steve was just going through, one of the things that I bet is sticking out to the Biden campaign is that number of Democrats who turned out, because the last percentage was 3% the last time, if I'm getting my numbers correct here. So it means it's much more than that. And what that means, Rachel, to them is that people were motivated to go out and participate in this, to vote against Donald Trump. Yep. That is a good sign for the Biden team because the concern has been people aren't excited, they're not energized. That's a good thing. We obviously don't know the entire breakdown of the independents, but those are also potential voters for Joe Biden. I mean, they look a lot at this number that was in the Washington Post earlier this week. It's about 81%, I believe, of Haley supporters or people who are supporting Haley in that poll who think that Biden was legitimately elected. Now, the bar is low. I think we can all agree. But to them, those are all people who might be Biden voters in a general election. So they do look at these numbers and the outcome of the Republican primary as telling them. They're learning something from it as well, and I'm sure they'll be digging through the data in the coming days as well.
Jen, very, very, very good point in terms of how the Democrats have to look at these results from New Hampshire and who can cross over to being a targetable Biden general election voter who might have turned out for Nikki Haley today? It's not a single set, right? It's an overlapping set.
This thing happened, I think it was a week and a half ago, whenever Asa Hutchinson withdrew from the campaign.
Oh,
I know.
remember?
He was still in the campaign.
Yeah.
And the DNC released this kind of snarky statement saying, oh, we had no idea you were even still in the campaign. I'm channeling their snark. And the White House immediately basically rescinded in an unofficial way, if you will, what the DNC had said. Karine Jean-Pierre was out there saying, you know, effectively, we don't condone this level of snark. I think, one, that's sort of principle in politics, but it's also a very canny strategy here. If you're voting for Asa Hutchinson, you sure might be Biden curious.
You are voting against Trump. Anybody who's against
Yes.
Trump, we will take you. Popular Front.
And I think it's not a coincidence that you're not hearing a lot about Nikki Haley and her voters and her lack of support or whatever, because as you and Jen just discussed, I mean, those are the Biden curious voters. Also, Rachel, we make fun of kind of like what a nothing burger the Biden result is, but there was some concern that Dean Phillips, who invested $5 million in New Hampshire, was maybe going to beat Biden or come really close to him. And as much as the White House will say we're not worried about a 30-party challenge, the optics of the sitting president getting a run for his money in New Hampshire, even if he wasn't on the ballot, by a gelato baron named Dean Phillips. Nothing against gelato.
I mean, there was
Gelato baron named, check notes, Dean Phillips. Yes.
You know, Ro Khanna was there. Jamie Raskin was up there, Maggie Hassan, the senator. They were all quietly doing the work to convince people that Joe Biden was worth writing in.
And somebody did an AI like attack on the Biden campaign, right? If this was unimportant, someone saw fit to actually send out fake robocalls of Joe Biden's voice.
With Joe Biden's voice.
And we have no idea who did that.
No idea who did. So there was a little bit of drama. But I think to the point that you're making, a little bit off of that point, there's a good reason why the Biden team is probably glad Nikki Haley doesn't get out, too, which is the longer she stays in, the more she triggers Donald Trump. And the more she triggers just with her physical presence, Donald Trump, the more he says the kinds of things that remind people why they'd rather have Joe Biden. Because he's going to keep birthering her. He's going to keep digging into the very kinds of, like, antics that have made him unacceptable to some independent
But then why are
voters.
they putting out these statements tonight downplaying the effect of her results?
Because they're not running against her. They definitely don't want to run against a much younger candidate who's making that very pointed argument about him on an age sort of area. So they don't want to run against her. They don't want to recognize her as a competitor, but I promise you they don't mind if she stays in.
Here's the thing. Every election night in the Trump era, basically the same trends pertain. And again tonight, like, Haley is now the proxy for the anti-Trump vote. Like, where is she doing well? Well, she's overperforming in places with high degrees of college attainment and in denser areas, right?
Yeah.
Those have been, when you control for other demographics, those are, and she's clobbering him where Dartmouth is, of course, and she's getting clobbered in Berlin, you know, in the north, in these industrial places and rural places. We have seen this time and time again. Here's the thing about this. Donald Trump is a uniquely polarizing figure in American politics and has been from the beginning. And sometimes, in certain contexts, like a Republican primary, that polarization cleaves such that he wins more voters off the polarization than he loses on it. At a national level, it has always lost him more voters than it's gained, which is why he lost the popular vote to Hillary Clinton, but pulled off the Electoral College trade. In certain states, it's worked for him, like in Missouri in the 2018 Senate race, where his polarization absolutely got Josh Hawley elected. The math worked in Missouri. It didn't work at the national level in 2020. It didn't work at a congressional level in 2022. It's back to working in a Republican primary. But the same dynamic is there, and the math is clear as day, staring you in the face when you look at that board there, when he's losing independents by 40 points and winning Republicans by 50. It's the same math.
But Chris, that math is also why the Biden White House is happy to let Nikki Haley stay in this fight.
Sure.
Let Donald Trump sink his money into her, sink his attacks against her, because they look at the math and say, at the end of the day, she can stay in this for a while, but we're still going to be running against Donald Trump. Let her bruise him. Let her empty his bank account, and then we'll take a look at him this summer.
Let me put up one of the exit polls we haven't talked about yet. Do you guys have this fitness exit poll? Can we put this up there? And this is comparing between Iowa and New Hampshire. The question here is, if Trump is convicted, is he fit to be president? Iowa electorate in the Iowa Republican caucuses last week, 65% of them said if Trump is convicted, he's still fit to be president. But nearly a third, 31%, said if he's convicted, he is not fit to be president. I mean, that is an Iowa caucus that Donald Trump won by 30 points, and still nearly a third of the people who turned out in that caucus said if he's convicted, I'm out. Look at New Hampshire tonight. 44% of New Hampshire voters saying if he is convicted, I am out. Yeah. And he may be winning by double digits in New Hampshire, and it may be something that makes him feel warm and toasty inside, because this had a lot of, independents and even Democratic-leaning independents in the electorate. But if 44% of the people who turned out in an electorate, maybe they did give him a double-digit lead, are out if he gets convicted.
There you go.
But then
it means the rapture option needs to be alive until the very last minute.
And why a Nikki Haley or even a Ron DeSantis didn't want to come straight for Trump and attack him, because if they do, that's attacking his voters. So if she just mildly attacks him, she's not kicking his voters out of bed, but if he gets nabbed by the government, she can say, like, remember, it's me. It wasn't that me.
Right. That's always been the strategy.
Do that in a two-person race. The pressure is going to be extreme.
He's making it easy for her when he mistakes her for Nancy Pelosi.
Yeah, so you're talking about it from Nikki Haley's vantage point. I think you're not really the MAGA base, which already doesn't like Nikki Haley and everything she represents, from her heritage to her corporate ties to her sort of rhino-esque impression that she's left, I think, on some of the field, is going to hate her even more if she is the thing standing between Donald Trump and the nomination.
It's
and that level of rage is going to go through the roof. I mean,
But the level of rage, the problem is it's a ping pong, right? It's attached to a cord that keeps hitting Donald Trump in the face, to Griffith's point, is that every time he hits her in a way that just happens to remind whatever independents are left out there that can't decide. He is constantly reminding people of why he is unacceptable to so many people.
Can I just say one last thing?
Yeah.
Just the end of this race was the most perfect distillation of the Donald Trump versus the rest of the field, which is that he closed on two messages. This, like, disgusting birtherism and racist nickname about her. And she wants to cut Social Security in Iowa. And it was just like, you could not produce a more succinct articulation of why Donald Trump has wrenched this party away from the people who used to run it.
Right. Yeah.
That's what they want, those two things.
Cutting Social Security, Paul, and we go to Paul Ryan.
Yeah, exactly.
Let's look at this. All right, with this win in New Hampshire tonight, Donald Trump takes a major step toward becoming the Republican nominee for president, of course. When he won last week in Iowa, his victory speech was a sort of politically sanitized version of the way he has otherwise been campaigning. The Iowa speech was lots of thank yous and praise for other Republicans, a notable lack of, Chris, what you were just describing in terms of the racist and birtherist attacks on Nikki Haley, and a notable lack in the Iowa victory speech of, promises to build camps to hold millions of people, or to root out his internal enemies like vermin. He didn't do that. And seeing him dial it back like that in Iowa, that's an important part of understanding the way this candidate and the Republican Party are going to try to win the election. So this is a decision that we revisit constantly, and that we will revisit constantly. But tonight, we're expecting Trump to speak momentarily. We are going to go to those remarks to see how he uses this moment, at least at first. We'll see how it goes. Again, this is a decision that is one that we consider to be an open-ended, live decision. Let's go to Trump headquarters right now in Nashua, New Hampshire.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Whoa. Well, I want to thank everybody. This is a fantastic state. This is a great, great state. You know, we won New Hampshire 3 times now. Three. We win it every time. We win the primary. We win the generals. We've won it, and it's a very, very special place to me. It's very important. If you remember, in 2016, we came here and we needed that win, and we won by 21 points, and it was great. And today, I have to tell you, it was very interesting, because I said, wow, what a great victory. But then somebody ran up to the stage all dressed up nicely when it was at 7. But now I just walked up and it's at 14. But she ran up when it was 7. And, you know, we have to do what's good for our party. And she was up, and I said, wow, she's doing...
So there we go. So this is part of the issue here. So Donald Trump saying that he won New Hampshire not only in previous primaries, but that he won New Hampshire in the general election is not true. Donald Trump did, to his credit, in 2016 win the New Hampshire Republican primary. He did, in 2020, win the New Hampshire Republican primary. But both in 2016, when he was competing against Hillary Clinton in the general election, he narrowly lost New Hampshire in the general election. And then in 2020, when he was competing against Joe Biden in the general election, he lost New Hampshire by a good, fair chunk of vote. So the former president has opened his remarks tonight once again by proclaiming falsehoods about previous elections. This is what makes it hard to take his pronouncements live. We'll try again, though. Here we go.
You have the now very unpopular governor of this state. This guy, he's got to be on something. I've never seen anybody with energy. He's like hopscotch. And, you know, I'm watching this guy, and 2 weeks ago he said, we're going to win in the landslide, we're going to win. About 3 days ago he started saying, well, we want to do well. That's a big difference. But I walked out just now, we're 14 points up, and I don't know what it's going to be. But when she was up here, it was like 6 or 7. And, you know, with like 7% of the vote counted. Now, let me just tell you, we had an unbelievable week last week in Iowa. We set a record. It was the best in the history of the caucus, in the history. And I remember I sort of had the same feeling. I'm up and I'm watching, and I said, she's taking a victory lap. And we beat her so badly, but Ron beat her also. You know, Ron came in second and he left. She came in third and she's still hanging around. The other thing, she only got 25% of the Republican votes. I don't know if you saw that. Tremendous numbers of independents came out because in this state, because you have a governor that doesn't frankly know what the hell he's doing, in this state, in the Republican primary, they accept Democrats to vote. In fact, I think they had 4,000 Democrats before October 6th. They already voted. Now, they're only voting because they want to make me look as bad as possible. Because if you remember, we won in 2016. And if you really remember, and if you want to play it straight, we also won in 2020. By more. And we did much better in 2020 than we did in 2016. But as they said, we lost by a whisker, just by a whisker. No. But we can't let that happen. You know, you have to have people that speak up. I said, I can go up and I can say to everybody, oh, thank you for the victory. It's wonderful. Or I can go up and say, who the hell was the imposter that went up on the stage before and like claimed a victory? She did very poorly, actually. She had to win. The governor said, she's going to win, she's going to win, she's going to win. Then she failed badly. Now, I have here, if he promises to do it in a minute or less, but the only person more angry than, let's say me, but I don't get too angry, I get even. The only person... because he was there, and he did fantastically well, by the way, and then he endorsed me. And we don't have to talk about Tim Scott, who, by the way, just got engaged, we have to tell you. And that's more important than all of this stuff. But a man that got to know her very well is Vivek. I said, Vivek, go up and say a few words about it. He has to do it in 1 minute or less, and then we're going to just say, we had one hell of a night tonight. And one other thing, before Vivek comes, do you see that poll? We're going to put it up. We have beaten Biden. You could almost say, who can't? Who the hell can't? The man can't put two sentences together. He can't find the stairs off a stage. Who can't? But Vivek, 1 minute or less. Go do it, Vivek. What we saw tonight.
Donald Trump giving an unusual victory speech in New Hampshire, in which he initially, at the outset of his remarks, said that he had won New Hampshire both not only previous primaries but had won in previous general elections. He lost both in 2016 and in 2020 in the New Hampshire general election contests. He then reiterated that and then handed over his victory speech to Vivek Ramaswamy, after saying we don't need to talk about Tim Scott, and by the way, he got engaged, and that's more important than any of this. And then we did one. So
he seemed to suggest also that the governor of New Hampshire is on some sort of drug. Yes. He said, "I don't know what he's on."
Baseless.
The governor, which I think is utterly baseless, just to be clear.
Yes.
But I just want to be clear, like you said this. He said it casually, we won the primaries and we won the general. He came back to linger on it.
Yeah.
Acknowledging at one point, like, they said we lost by a whisper, but really we won, and we won in 2016, and we won by a bigger amount in 2020. And again, like, there are misstatements, there are, half-truths politicians tell, but, like, the fundamental core lie that is the core of the whole democratic crisis the country faces right now revolves around this just simple matter of history. You see it reflected in 2/3 of Iowa primary voters saying that Joe Biden was not legitimately elected. 1/2 of those voters in New Hampshire, so this is just in a different category, I would submit.
Well, let's just be really clear about this, right? So Trump saying tonight, after having won the New Hampshire primary, which he has done twice before, having then gone on to say, that's not enough. You can't just claim credit. You have to claim credit. You have to falsify the election results in the 2 times that you lost the state, is a form of, like, reality bullying in a way. And he's done this around Iowa as well. So, for example, he doesn't have bragging rights about winning the Iowa caucuses. He lost the Iowa caucuses in 2016 to Ted Cruz. But after winning the Iowa caucuses this time, he said, it's really great to have won it for 3 times in a row. Yeah. And he knows that it's not true, and he knows that everybody listening to him knows that it's not true. It's like his insistence on the date of the Spanish flu epidemic, or his insistence on what the hurricane track was going to be that he had to draw in with a Sharpie. It's an exercise in bending reality to his will and insisting that others follow. It's an exercise in making people who love him denounce reality and endorse his view instead as a form of fealty, as a form of loyalty. And it's a way of breaking the truth in our country and showing that his most loyal people will do that in a performative and effacing way.
It's called religious faith.
The psychiatrists who wrote the book about him, literally, all agreed that this is a very serious, lifelong problem. He's now in his, 70th year of never being satisfied with reality, even on the days when he wins, because life can never, ever give him what he wants, his insecurity being so profoundly deep and permanent. The victory speech, by the way, in political campaigns in the primary season is always supposed to be about winning more voters.
Yes, uniting the party.
In the next election, whether that's the general election or the next state. You are supposed to reach out to voters who expressed a different feeling tonight. Say, reach out to the voters who voted for Haley. You don't have to specify that that's what you're doing, but every politician prior to Donald Trump has found a way to do that. He never has.
And just, I think it's because you set it up with the last time, which is that, throughout these however many years we are now into this, 9 years, I suppose, right? 2015 is when he sort of starts. There have always been these moments where there's he's able to sort of perform some version of conventional campaigning. He stays on script, and people say, "Oh, if only that," it's like a joke, it's a trope, right? If only that Donald Trump. And so, last time in Iowa, it was a more conventional. It was gracious. It was thank you. So I'm glad that we saw that, because that's the sort of this sort of petulant incoherence, which is really kind of it's really the rhetorical register that he is at all times. I mean, and particularly in the last 3 days on the trail. I mean, I don't know if people have been seeing the clips, but it is a constant degree of essentially petulant incoherence. That has been the sort of general vibe, much different than the rare moment of something approaching composure.
Slow that down, though. Petulant incoherence.
Yes.
When you say incoherence, what do you mean?
Well, I saw him speak earlier about gas prices. in his, he talked about gas prices, and he said they're higher than they've ever been. You know, they were $2 when I left. Okay, so they're not higher than they've ever been. They're below $3. It's just reality. They were $2 during COVID when no one was on the road. Okay, so. But you know they're throwing everything to have it, so it's coming down now. But if he gets in, they never know what's going to happen with the gas. So again, this is just the sort of it's the salesman patois, it's the sort of pitter patter. But this has been the sort of general rhetorical mode, and people have noted it. Nikki Haley, in her speech tonight, talking about the fact that he was sort of ranting about January 6th and said that Nikki Haley was the one who had destroyed some evidence or had not destroyed evidence, had not allowed them to bring the National Guard in when he meant it was actually Nancy Pelosi. That general aggrieved but hard to follow vibe has been the candidate Trump of this campaign.
But it's also been the Donald Trump of his life. I mean, if you look at his biography,
yes.
right, the one religion that his family was ever associated with was Norman Vincent Peale, the power of positive thinking. And it is part of, I mean, if you read Mary Trump's biography and others about the way he grew up, it is this notion that to lose is to be a loser.
Yes.
And to lose is actually the greatest sin. It's the one thing you can't do that his parents would never allow you to get away with, you know. And you really see it as he's gotten older that it is now enhanced by this kind of tick. The things that trigger him, he can't stop ranting about them. And sometimes he substitutes the thing that triggers him most for the thing he's talking about.
Yes,
so
right.
when Barack Obama is triggering him, he'll say Barack Obama when he means Joe Biden, right? If he's triggered by Nikki Haley, he says Nikki Haley when he means Nancy Pelosi. So he's super triggered, but he also is, you know, acclimatized and was raised by this sort of Norman Vincent Peale. And if you look back at like videos of this guy back when he was a speaker, it was all about bending reality to your will.
Because she has been invoked, we must summon her. Joining us now, I'm very, very pleased to say, is Nancy Pelosi, the former House Speaker, the current Speaker Emerita. Madam Speaker, we have so much to ask you. We're so glad you could be here with us tonight.
My pleasure. Thank you.
You have been invoked.
To be with you.
You have been invoked in this current discussion that we are having, I'm sorry to say, because the former president, in campaigning in New Hampshire, did repeatedly try to attack you over the response to the January 6th insurrection at the U.S. Capitol building. His opponent, Nikki Haley, has made a lot of hay out of the fact that in trying to attack you, he kept using her name instead. We've heard what Nikki Haley thought about that confusion, that mistake by Donald Trump, but I don't know what you thought about it, and I'm curious.
Well, let me just say I'm not going to spend too much time on Donald Trump's cognitive disorders. But what I am going to say, and I want to, in friendship, say to Chris, he tried to say that Nikki Haley did not allow the National Guard to come, but it was Nancy Pelosi. It was nobody. It was Donald Trump. He knows, and you know, that Mitch McConnell, Chuck Schumer, and I begged for hours for the National Guard to come. He knows that we don't have the authority to bring the National Guard. The president does. Sad to say for the District of Columbia, because every other state, the governor has that power. So I'm more concerned about what he was trying to accuse her of than, again, his many misrepresentations. But don't spend so much time on him. We don't agonize about him. We organize. And Joe Biden is our nominee, and he's going to be, again, he and Kamala Harris are again going to be president and vice president of the United States. It's now the time. The intensity has arrived. The election year is here. As you see, some folks have come over from the White House, Jill O'Malley Dillon and Mike Donilon, two stars of the political arena in our country, joining Julie. Julie is wonderful, Julie Chavez Rodriguez. She's done a great job as the campaign manager. She has the biggest record of money raised for a presidential campaign. More importantly, she's mobilizing at the grassroots level. We organize, and they will come now together with the message to go forward. The message, so when he lies, I mean, he's a constant liar, but when he lies, sometimes you have to listen to him. For example, he lied and said, Obamacare sucks. I mean, to use his kind of language. Obamacare sucks. listen to when he says that. Of course, it doesn't. Affordable Care Act cures. So in the campaign, people have to understand that their well-being is on the ballot. Whether it's a woman's right to choose, which yesterday we observed the 51st anniversary of when that became respected in our country until his judges pulled that down, and he brags about that. He says he's going to terminate the Affordable Care Act. And what does that mean to you? If you have a pre-existing condition, if you have a child in college, after college who still needs health care, if you're a woman, being a woman is no longer a pre-existing condition. The list goes on and on about the benefits of the Affordable Care Act. So people have to understand, listen when he speaks, because he does not have your interest at heart, even though you may not, I respect as you see your interest, but I make sure that you know how you are affected by some of what he says, whether it's guns, whether it's climate, whether it's a woman's right to choose, whether it's health care. In 2018, people said to me, weren't you lucky that health care became the central issue of the campaign, and that's how you won 40 seats and win the House? I said, no, we weren't lucky. We made our own luck. So let's get on with it. Let's forget about him and his dysfunction and understand that we have to get out our vote. We have to mobilize, own the ground. We have to message in the interest. As Lincoln said, public sentiment is everything. With it, you can accomplish almost anything. Without it, practically nothing. And we have to have the financial resources, and Joe Biden has proven that he can attract that. Message, mobilization, money. Joe Biden, great vision, great knowledge, great strategic thinker, great legislator, and a person with a big heart and empathy for the American people.
Speaker Pelosi, it's Alex Wagner. Thanks for joining us tonight. How are you? In addition to abortion and the ACA, it seems like one of the issues that's very much front of mind with Republican voters tonight and those who may not be fans of Donald Trump is whether or not he is going to be convicted. I'll point you to some of the exit polling we have tonight. 47% of Republican New Hampshire primary voters say they would not consider Donald Trump fit to be president if he were convicted of a crime. Last week, 31% of Iowa caucus goers said effectively the same. As of this evening, he's almost certainly going to be the nominee. I do have to ask you, should the American people know whether they are potentially voting for a convicted felon? You established a January 6th committee in June, I believe, of 2021. It held its first public hearing in July of 2021. Do you take any issue, given that history and the fact that you're an American voter, with the timeline that the Department of Justice has pursued on this, both in terms of the investigation and the prosecution of Donald Trump?
Well, let me say that no one in our country is above the law. And that certainly applies to someone who wants to be president of the United States. And many of the transgressions that the president has engaged in are about his integrity. But it's also about our security. But people, his base doesn't seem to care about some of that in those states and in any event. But the fact is they have to know what it means in their lives, that they're no longer going to have affordable care, that there will be a national ban on access to an abortion. So the election's about freedom, democracy, yes, writ large, but it's also about your personal freedom in your lives. And all the things that Joe Biden did in the campaign, in his presidency, with the help of Democrats in the House and Senate, I might add, and modestly, were great things to create jobs. 26, but how many million more jobs? 16 million jobs created. The market hit 38,000. Now it's down to 37.9 or something today, but record high. What that means to people's 401ks. The issue about, again, child tax or Biden child tax credit, what that means to women to be in the workplace, actually dads too, but in the workplace. So we have to carefully and with great, shall we say, prioritizing, make sure people understand. While they may want to vote for a convicted felon, do they want to vote for somebody who's going to take away your health care, especially if you have a pre-existing condition or a child with one? Or do you want to make sure that your daughter, wife, sister, someone in your family has no freedom to make a judgment about her reproductive health? Do you want to vote for somebody who ignores that in the country, 80-some% of American people think there should be background checks for purchasing of firearms to reduce the violence in our country? And young people care so much about the climate issue, which this person doesn't, I don't even have to say understands it, much less understands, or is solely in the pocket of the fossil fuel industry, which is probably blocking his understanding of the fate of our planet. So the fate of our democracy, the fate of our planet, the personal decisions for people at their kitchen table. How are they going to make ends meet? We reduce the cost of prescription drugs. Insulin in the IRA bill. Yeah. Insulin before the bill was $500 to $600 a month for seniors on Medicare, and now it's $35 a month. They want to change that back because they're in the pocket of fossil fuel industry, they're in the pocket of farmer, they're in the pocket of the gun industry. So people have to, we have to have clarity, and again, prioritizing and that's what we did in 2020, when 22, when people said, you're going to lose 30, 40 seats. We said, we're not. I don't know why the people that sit in Washington or New York and say these things when they're not in the hinterlands. We're into the fight, on the ground, mobilizing and fighting. We knew that gun violence protection, a woman's right to choose, climate and democracy and health care were very important. And the contrast, we had to make the contrast. This is what your member of Congress has voted for. This is what our candidate is for. And that's why we kept the minimum to 5 seats difference rather than 30 or 40 as was predicted. So again, we have to get out there and get the job done, and we have a mobilization. But I just say this one more thing: when we saved the Affordable Care Act, remember when? Yes. He was going to, repeal and replace, but whatever the replace was, nobody ever knew. We had 10,000 events throughout the country where people came forward and told their stories. Nothing more eloquent than that. Certainly more eloquent than the misrepresentation of the president, former occupant of the White House, when he says Obamacare sucks. Let's have a fight about that.
I feel like Democrats have their marching orders if they have tuned into this program this evening. Speaker Emerita Nancy Pelosi, a treat to have you on in this sort of critical moment for the presidential race. Thanks for your time tonight. Rachel.
Nancy Pelosi
Just win, baby. Just win, baby.
Just win, baby. Saying that she does not want to talk about his cognitive disorders, and she does not want to talk about him and his dysfunctions. And instead laying out what it is she does want to talk about.
Veiled.
Well,
sort of.
We just heard Nancy Pelosi there saying the election is about democracy and freedom writ large, also about freedom and individual lives. President Biden and Vice President Harris have been making that exact same case, and they did so today at a campaign stop in Virginia. We've got some sound from that queued up for you, plus more about what happened tonight in New Hampshire and what's about to happen in this campaign and the road ahead. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Let's go back to Nashua, New Hampshire, where our own Vaughn Hilliard is at Trump campaign headquarters. Trump gave his victory speech tonight. We bowed out after he twice claimed to have won the New Hampshire general election contest in 2016 and 2020, neither of which was true. He also seemed to be handing the microphone off to other people, not himself. Vaughn, can you tell us what we missed there, if we need to know?
I think 2 key moments worth taking in. Number one, there was a moment in which he started on about Nikki Haley, and he gave a forewarning about what is to come for her if she indeed stays in this race, as she indicated tonight. He said, quote, "A little note to Nikki, she's not going to win. But if she did, she'd be under investigation by those people in 5 minutes for things she doesn't want to talk about." This takes me back again, yet again, to 8 years ago. It was at this juncture when Donald Trump went on the attack against Ted Cruz, but using red herrings like that, calling into question Ted Cruz's marriage, calling into question whether his dad was a part of the JFK assassination. And here on stage tonight, with only one rival left in as Nikki Haley, there goes Donald Trump on the stage today, throwing out this idea of stuff that would be investigated. And of course, the question would be, what stuff? Donald Trump doesn't actually have that stuff to throw out there. The one other note that I would have wanted to mention was you saw Tim Scott standing right there behind him, of course, endorsing him over the weekend here in New Hampshire. There was a moment in which Donald Trump, he referred to the South Carolina senator and said, quote, "You must really hate her," referring to Nikki Haley because she was the one that appointed him to the U.S. Senate. The room went quiet. Tim Scott just stood there in silence and smiled before taking a step forward to the microphone, and he responded, "I just really love you." It was a very uncomfortable moment, but one in which we have seen Republican rivals continually bend the knee to Donald Trump and him use them as instruments and mock them in the loyalty that they have given here at such a crucial time as this for the Republican Party, Rachel.
NBC's Vaughn Hilliard, thank you very much for that report. So there we have it. That's what we miss when we cut away. Does anyone hear in that a case for not cutting away from that speech?
Yeah, here, I would like that clip, please.
Also, the humiliation is so naked at this point. To ask Tim Scott to go up and directly sort of demean the person that gave him his Senate seat in 2012 is just...
Well, it also kind of raises the question. Has Trump run out of material? You know, the victory speech doesn't have to be long. You know, solid 8 minutes would be fine. 10 minutes would be fine.
2 minutes would be fine.
Sure.
You did great. See you in South Carolina. We're going to kick butt.
Haley's speech was a tight, solid speech. He couldn't fill the time. He couldn't do it. That's what other reason would he turn to those people? Unless he thought, you know, Vivek will do a more vicious attack than I will do, and I want him to do that.
We didn't see Vivek's speech, but I think, remember when he was president, one of the things he loved to do was to force people to ritually praise him or to ritually humiliate them. And I think that he saw this night as just a night to ritually humiliate people like Tim Scott. Maybe Vivek had to get up there and grovel. Like, literally, he just wants to see his former rivals grovel.
He said, when he said we're going to put 1 minute on the clock, it's like, I'm going to make sure that you know your place.
Your place.
Yeah. But to your point, and actually to sort of synthesize this with Nancy Pelosi, I mean, so there's a few different ways that to think about this sort of upcoming general, if in fact he's the nominee, right? There's the legal troubles, which are going to play out. We're still expecting word from the D.C. Circuit about the immunity. That could happen whenever. There is the personal performance of Donald Trump, which people really don't like. I know it's hard to like, because he's been around so long, it's hard to like get this into people's heads, but like that stuff doesn't play well. There's a reason he has high unfavorables. There's a reason that he's been a negatively polarizing figure and was not particularly politically successful in those elections in which he was associated. But then the third thing, and I think this is interesting in terms of Nancy Pelosi's strategy, is like he kind of wants to run a complete policy-free campaign. Mm-hmm. So you never know, like you would think, to your point about the victory speech, it's like you come out and you hammer your themes. Like, what are they? What are you running on? Like, the reason you come out is you're going to get some airtime and you could talk to voters. It's going to be an audience bigger than just the primary to be like, this is what I'm running on. I'm running against the trade deals or whatever. You know, and he had a few of those in 2016. There's not a lot there. Like, I don't know, like, what is
Justice for the January 6th hostages.
Correct.
Right? Like, you're going to try to sell that to America?
Don't put me in jail.
And don't, right. So that is an immigration. I mean, border is the only policy area the Republican Party and Donald Trump will talk about, that they're focused on, that they want to talk about, is the border. Not even just immigration. It's the border more specifically. Right. Because once you even move outside of that, they don't really want to talk about anything having to do with immigration policy. Right. Once you move from that question, it is unbelievable how steeply that cliff drops off to talk about. And this is where I think Nancy Pelosi, who guided that strategy in 2018, which was very successful, was correct, which is like, people do care that you're talking about their lives and things that may or may not affect them, whether you're going to take away their right to choose or their health care or whatever it is.
We're going to take one quick break right now. We'll be right back on the other side of this with more of our special coverage of the New Hampshire primary. In 2016, Donald Trump won the New Hampshire primary by a lot. He had just lost in Iowa, but in 2016, when he came to New Hampshire, he beat his nearest rival, John Kasich, by about 20 points. Ahead of that New Hampshire victory in 2016, Trump had racked up endorsements from precisely 0 Republicans in Congress, none in the House, none in the Senate, not even any sitting governors either. So you contrast that New Hampshire experience in 2016 for Trump with what has just happened tonight. As of tonight, heading into today's New Hampshire primary, a majority, more than half of all Republicans in the House and Senate had already endorsed Trump. Again, by this point in the race in 2016, that number was 0. He's now got a majority of elected Republicans in Washington. Former presidential contender Tim Scott was the latest high-profile senator to endorse Trump before tonight on Friday. After Ron DeSantis dropped out this weekend, he too endorsed Trump. That makes him the 11th sitting Republican governor to do so. And now just tonight, in the wake of Trump's victory in New Hampshire, Senator John Cornyn has said that in order to beat President Biden, Republicans need to unite around one candidate, and that one candidate should be Donald Trump, which is an interesting position for him to take, given that only last year, John Cornyn, same guy, was saying that Donald Trump cannot win in 2024. What this is full consolidation of the Republican Party behind Donald Trump. It raises the question of what room there is for Nikki Haley to make progress among Republicans. Given the results tonight, given her performance among Republican voters in New Hampshire, and given the overall margin in New Hampshire, what is her deer trail out of this particular wilderness? Let's head over to Steve Kornacki at the big board.
Take a look here. I'll call it up here to the latest results. And I think this does, well, let's get New Hampshire up here. And I think let's get to that question here. As soon as I can get it up on the screen. Okay, the question here of what Haley is going to come out of New Hampshire with tonight, which gets to the final margin, which gets to where she's getting her votes from, where Donald Trump is getting his votes from. And I think we've been sort of saying she wants to keep this in single digits. And what sort of happened tonight, to put this in some perspective, is obviously we showed you the exit poll early in the night, which from Haley's standpoint had some encouraging news for her, just in terms of the composition of the electorate. It looked like it is, a very high number of independents who are in this electorate, and even Democrats. The current exit poll with all of the waves put in right now has Democrats at 6% of this electorate. Again, it's usually 2, 3, so it's double, triple what you'd usually expect for that. So that was good news for Haley. And the initial reports we saw were from cities like Dover and Concord and Keene, where she was doing quite well, doing basically what she needed to do to make this a race statewide. What has happened since, though, we talked about this particularly in small towns and in rural New Hampshire, she's just getting swamped. She needed to be, like she was in Iowa. We talked about this in Iowa. A lot of rural counties, a lot of counties with low median income, with low college attainment. She wasn't even getting out of single digits in Iowa. And she's not, she's out of single digits here because it's a two-person race, but she's getting swamped in a lot of those places. So that has held her back from really making this competitive statewide. And then she's had some other things kind of go wrong for her. Take a look at this one. I think this is the biggest on the board right now. Nashua is the second largest city in the state. And this is one Haley didn't just need to win. She needed to win this thing by a pretty comfortable margin. And on paper, to be winning statewide, that was essential. It looks like we've got a little bit left in Nashua. It looks like she's not even going to win Nashua tonight. Trump's actually going to gain votes here. And again, look, the city of Manchester, which, again, we thought going in, if Haley, to make it a game statewide, needed to be basically tied here, maybe up a point, maybe down a point. She now is going to lose this thing basically by 16 points in Manchester. And when you start to look at what's left, there are some areas where Haley's going to make up ground that are not colored in this map. City of Lebanon, we've talked about. Hanover, where Dartmouth is. You can go up here where Durham, the State University, University of New Hampshire, no numbers there. Exeter. Those are 4 places here where Haley's going to get a lot of votes. Also, we could expect a lot out of Hollis. We could expect a lot out of Merrimack, out of Amherst next door. These are vote centers for Haley that's still to come. Here's the problem, though, for her on top of all of that. Some of the places here, we just start taking a look. Atkinson, Salem. Salem is the 6th largest town in New Hampshire. It's got more than 30,000 people. It was one of Donald Trump's best towns in 2016. Remember, I said the border, the suburbs, the bedroom communities aren't necessarily the moderate, independent enclaves. Salem is a perfect example. We don't have numbers from here yet, but based on everything we're seeing, this should be a blowout Trump win where he really gains a big plurality. I mean, that's going to be true as well. We expect the same thing to happen in Pelham. We expect that to happen potentially in Windham when that comes in. Derry, we've had reporters there, I know. Derry's another big community where I think based on what we're seeing, you can can expect Trump to get a lot of numbers out of that. So what it all kind of adds up to here is, again, we've got half the vote in right now, 48%. Trump is leading this by 11.2%. I think there's a very, very real possibility that it's very plausible that Donald Trump is going to end up winning the state by double digits. When Nikki Haley took the stage earlier, there were some indications there were far less vote in. We're looking at that exit poll, and it looked like, hey, this might be a 5-6 point race, and she could go make some noise based on that. But if this ends up, 10, 11, 12 points for Donald Trump, and he's winning essentially 3/4 of the Republican vote. She's only getting 25%, as we showed you, the Republican vote. What is she walking out of this state with tonight to go make her competitive in any other state? Because this mix that we've seen tonight, we've talked so much about, there will be some states that can come close to this. The only one I can think of, it's not actually a state, but the only place I can think of based on this demographic mix that I could see Haley absolutely winning in is the District of Columbia. They've got 19 delegates. Donald Trump got 13% there in 2016. Kasich and Rubio combined for well over 60% of the vote. I don't think he's going to win the District of Columbia if she's still an active candidate there. It's very hard to find other places where she could actually post a win based if this wasn't enough for her and it ends up being double digits. And like I said, the other big problem becomes then this is not like the Democratic primaries. This is not like the Democratic primaries where everybody, as long as you get 15%, is getting a delegate out of every single congressional district on the map. The rules in most of the states and in most of the big states on Super Tuesday are you win a congressional district, you get every single you get 50%. You get every single delegate in it. You get 50% statewide, you get every at-large delegate. And functionally, in a two-person race, all Trump has to do basically is beat Haley. In any given congressional district, in any given state, he could beat her by 2 points. He would take all of the delegates. And again, just based on the fact that Haley's still only at 25% with Republicans, and you're really not going to see this mix anywhere else. You know where else you might see this mix? You might see it next door in Vermont. That could be a target for her. Vermont with a negligible number of delegates, though. I'm talking about Texas, talking about California, Alabama, Arkansas, Oklahoma, Michigan. These are states where, Trump's just got to go in there and win a congressional district by even a single vote. He'll get all the delegates out of it. So it's designed on the Republican side, unlike the Democratic side, not to be a 6-month slog that could even be active going into the convention. It's designed to be wrapped up quickly. And just taking this mix, Trump with this kind of mix would be poised for a massive, massive Super Tuesday. And even before Super Tuesday, he'd be poised for a very, very big win in South Carolina if Haley's only getting 25% of Republicans.
Yeah, I mean, those numbers go a long way in explaining why. I think Mark Leibovich described him as Nikki Haley's fleece-clad parrot. Chris Sununu, the governor of New Hampshire, 2 weeks ago says, yeah, I'm going to vote for Donald Trump if he's the eventual nominee, even if he's convicted of a felony, right? There's this understanding in the Republican Party that all roads lead to Trump. And I think, for people who haven't been paying attention to down ballot, there's been a pretty significant development, which is that House Republicans who won in districts that Biden won in 2020 have begun endorsing Trump. Nick LaLotta.
So vulnerable Republicans.
Vulnerable Republicans, not from deep red districts. We're talking Nick LaLotta on Long Island. I think John Duarte in California. Biden won that district by 11 points. Endorsing Trump, right? The sort of pressure points are not the same for them as they are for the rest of the Republican conference. And you're seeing this capitulation that, you look at the map that Steve just showed us, it's a bulldozer plowing through the next several primary races. And, you're seeing that reality dawn for Republicans.
Although Nikki Haley as mayor of Washington, I would like to see that contest.
Yes. Yes.
And why not? Everyone needs a second act. Look, I guess I see it like this. Good night for Trump, not a great night for Trump, precisely for the reasons we've discussed. When you're standing on that much ground and you're only doing this number, then you have some weaknesses, even if, yes, you're clearly being declared the front runner by your party. And so you think back to 8 years ago, right? 8 years ago. Feels like a long time to me in the news business. And I remember where I was because I was in New Hampshire inside the hall watching Trump come on stage and win. And he won by about 55,000 votes and 20-plus points. And that was a great night for him. And he did it, as you pointed out in the lead, Rachel, without any of the institutional support and having
zero endorsements,
basically taking over the party and coming off a disappointing start in Iowa based on what he had hoped for. And so right now, again, we have to be careful with projection, but with half the vote in, he's up 16,000 votes. When you say it like that, it doesn't sound like all that big a gap. Now, all the projections are true, and the coalition doesn't necessarily materialize in every other state. But if you are the former president and you are the most famous and Fox News is back selling you and you're doing those town halls and you never had to square off in a debate or adversarial interview and you have all the endorsements and everybody's gearing up for you, and over at Davos all the elite buddies said it's going to be your year and you're going to win because you're not an outsider, if you ever were, but you certainly ain't anymore by even the narrow standards of Republican outsider. And what do you have at this hour? 16,000 more votes. So he may be very well on the path, and there are people who study this, but I don't call it a great night for him. It looks to me like a good night, and standing on a whole lot, facing off against one person, and she's only had 2 campaign days in a 2-person race. That's where he is. He's 16,000 up.
So one of the relevant frames to use in looking at what Trump achieved tonight and didn't achieve is what Joe Biden achieved. Someone else came in second tonight. Dean Phillips, running against Joe Biden, is coming in second with 20% of the vote among the unofficial Democratic primary that they had there. The model that he had going into New Hampshire was Gene McCarthy in 1968, who won 42% of the vote against the sitting President Lyndon Johnson, who also had a write-in campaign. Johnson didn't bother to have his name on the ballot, just like Biden. Both of them ran unofficial write-in campaigns. So Dean Phillips got completely crushed, didn't come close to the threshold. If Gene McCarthy had gotten 20% in 1968, that would have been the end. No one would have talked about it again. Bobby Kennedy probably would have rethought his plan to get into the race after seeing how strong LBJ was. So Joe Biden demonstrates this enormous strength in New Hampshire tonight. And then you have Trump showing much greater weakness against a credible challenger. And it depends on how you want to look at Trump. He wants to be called president in court and everywhere. So let's call him president just for this moment. When a president is on the ballot in the New Hampshire primary, you're supposed to win everything. You're not supposed to face a serious challenge. And when you do, you lose. There is no president who faced a serious challenge in the New Hampshire primary who then won in November. And so this is a very bad night for Donald Trump, looking at the pattern of presidents in New Hampshire primary situations who face very serious challenges.
So is what we're saying here is that he's very likely to win the nomination, and the way that he's winning shows him to be a very weak general election candidate.
He's likely to win the nomination the way George H.W. Bush was still likely to win the nomination after Pat Buchanan went to New Hampshire and almost knocked him out. And then George H.W. Bush did win the nomination.
Yeah, he won the nomination and then got
one term in the presidency was over.
Yeah, to put it in a sentence, there's a difference between being feared within your party and appealing or popular within the nation.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, if New Hampshire is the avatar for what independent voters want and would choose, given the option, given the fact that anyone could play in that independent side, Nikki Haley beat Donald Trump among independents by something like 40 percentage points. That is not a good sign for a former president of the United States who, again, wants to be seen as president. Yes, he will beat her in South Carolina. But let's not forget that one of the things that Joe Biden did was to remake the calendar such that he was not on the ballot in New Hampshire, still mopped up Dean Phillips in New Hampshire when he wasn't even on the ballot as a write-in candidate. Yes, Donald Trump will likely win South Carolina, Nikki Haley's home state. Joe Biden might win it by more because that state is built for Joe Biden, just like on the Republican side, it's built for Donald Trump. So tonight, the winner, if you want to look at all of the metrics for a general election, the winner tonight is Joe Biden, who won in New Hampshire decisively as a write-in, who is going to win decisively in South Carolina. And the story that Donald Trump thinks he's going to get out of South Carolina, Joe Biden will get one of equal value. to him. And in the end, he's got a better story to tell in November because he's not facing 91 criminal counts.
Yeah. Let me ask, and Steve Kornacki, I'd love to ask your advice on this. And this isn't about data from tonight, but it's about sort of recent history in campaigns. One of the electability arguments that's being made on the Republican side is that it's important for the Republicans to unify now, for them to end their primary now, that deciding on a candidate now gives them a better shot at the general election, gives them a longer runway in terms of what they want to line up against Joe Biden. When I think about that, Steve, I think about John Kerry wrapping it up quickly in 2004 and then losing to George W. Bush. I think about Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama battling right down to the very last second in 2008. That's making for a very short general election campaign in 2008, but one that the Democrats ultimately won. Is there any way that you think about it in terms of the lived history that we've got of the primaries versus the generals, as to whether or not there is a case to be made that it might help the Republicans to have a nominee sooner rather than later?
Well, I think the way I look at it is, and I love historical, precedents, and I love talking about them and bringing them in, but I think the reality is there is no modern precedent for what we're seeing. We could talk about whether Trump should be considered an incumbent president or not. He sure didn't look like an incumbent president at the start of this campaign in terms of how he was polling. His support grew over the course of last spring and last summer. In modern history, how many former presidents have turned around 4 years after losing the office and tried to reclaim it? In modern history, the answer is zero. What's the closest parallel we have? Gerald Ford explored running for president in 1979 after losing it in 1976. He was an unelected president. He was polling second place in the summer and fall of 1979 to Ronald Reagan. Ford saw the polls and didn't run. That's your closest parallel. That's not much of a parallel. So I think we're in a very different place. And I think one of the things we've seen pretty consistently here is I think a lot of people have already been looking at this race as inevitable, a Trump versus Joe Biden race.
Right.
And that is why opinion on both of them is so strong and, in my view, is so set in place. There are going to be people, there are up for grabs voters, there are swing voters, there are voters who it's a question about are they their potential voters, are they actually going to be motivated to turn out? I think that's going to be one of the biggest questions as we head into the fall of 2024. But I think the bottom line is people know both of these candidates extremely well, have extremely strong opinions of them. They do not have a good opinion at all of Donald Trump, but you have to keep in mind they do not have a good opinion at all of Joe Biden. His average approval rating now is 39%. The last time our network polled a Trump versus Biden matchup, Trump was winning nationally by 2 points. We have polled since the start of 2019 a Trump versus Joe Biden matchup. NBC has 16 times. The first 14 times, that's all of 2019, all of 2020, and the first 9 months of 2023. The first 14 times Joe Biden led Donald Trump. In the 2020 cycle, the lead was never short of 6 points. It was as high as 12 points. That was the range. Then this fall, for the first time, we had a tie, Trump versus Biden. In our final poll of the year, we had Trump ahead of Biden, something we'd never seen before. The reality is, when you look at the polling out there, whether it's our polling or any of the other quality polls that are out there, looking at a Trump-Biden rematch, you're seeing something that you didn't see in 2019, in 2020, and for that matter, that you didn't see in 2016. And that is, at least in the polls, a strength for Trump relative to Biden that he never showed in 19 and 20. I defy you to find more than a single poll in 2019 and 2020, a single quality poll that put Trump ahead nationally. They just didn't exist. Every poll was just a question of how much was he behind. Now we're looking at polls that actually have Trump tied, actually have Trump ahead in the popular vote. And we've talked about, do Republicans have a bit of an advantage in the Electoral College where if they're even competitive for the popular vote, that's going to translate into a big boost in the Electoral College. And we've seen statewide polls, some of these swing state polls, some of these states that Biden won in 20, that Trump had won in 2016, that were critical to his election as president in the first place. We've seen Trump racking up some very big numbers, or some very impressive numbers there, again, relative to how he's polled before. So to me, it raises a question. We're looking at a different atmosphere, I think, than we saw in 2020, than we saw in 2016, and I think that we've ever seen in a modern presidential race before. And it's one that I think is sort of dominated by questions. When you see a poll right now that has Donald Trump ahead of Joe Biden or competitive with Joe Biden nationally, the questions that are raised are, where's the new strength coming from? One of the places that picking up on it in the polls is younger voters. Is that real? Are younger voters actually backing away a bit from Biden? Are they actually going to go out there and vote for Trump? Or are they actually going to stay on the sidelines in some meaningful number that they didn't in 2020 and they didn't in 2016? That's a big factor. That's part of what we're seeing in these polls right now. Is that actually going to we weren't seeing it in 20. We're seeing it now. Is that going to translate when you get to Election Day 2024? For that matter, we talked all in 2016 and all in 2020 how the polls in both years completely missed a crucial section of Trump supporters, particularly in the upper Midwest and the Midwest states. Those are white voters, rural, not a college degree, low trust in the media, unable to reach them in polls, even though the whole methodology was changed between 2016 and 2020. Is that a factor again? Is that still in play? Is there something about Trump being on the ballot? Because he wasn't on the ballot in name in 2022. He was in 20 and he was in 16. He brought them out in 16. He brought them out in 20. In 18 and 22, Republicans had bad years in the midterms, but Trump himself wasn't on the ballot. Does Trump's presence on the ballot bring them out again in 2024? These are the questions I think that we have, but a lot of them just stem from the fact that so much is known about these two candidates. Opinion is so deep, so entrenched. We're left with questions about turnout. We're left with questions about what exactly the electorate's going to look like. But look, if it ends up being the longest general election in history, and if Haley's out of the race by March 3rd, it will be the longest general election in history. I think it's one that's shaping up to be extremely close right now, because while there is, as I said, while there is a lot of negative opinion about Trump, there is about Biden too, and that's a difference between 20 and 24. Biden's the incumbent president, an incumbent president with an approval rating under 40%. If that persists to election, that's another if. Will that persist to Election Day? Will the economic news get better? Will Biden's numbers improve? Completely possible. But if it doesn't, and you're an incumbent president walking into Election Day with an approval rating anything like Joe Biden has right now, does Trump start to look a little different to a crucial, small but crucial sect of voters? That could decide the election.
Right, and on top of all that, does politics matter? Meaning, does politicking matter? If we're going to have the longest general election campaign in history, how good are these two old guys at campaigning against each other? Yes, we've seen it before, but we saw it before when they were a little bit younger, and we saw it before there was a lot of this water under the bridge, and we saw it at a time there was a global pandemic, which prohibited a lot of the normal forms of campaigning. And so what's going to happen once these two are in a general election matchup has a lot to do with the art of politicking, and that is as much of a black box as any of this.
And to build on that, it's been a modern, so Kennedy and Nixon in 1960, the first televised presidential debates. They didn't have them in 64, 68, and 72. Since 1976, it's been a staple of our fall every 4 years. The presidential debates, and then sometimes the vice presidential debate, too. We're going to have those?
Yeah.
We're getting strong indications for the first time we may not have debates between these two candidates. Now, I'll throw one more in there. It's been a while since we've had third-party candidates registering very significant support. And I don't know what's going to happen with RFK Jr. I don't know what's going to happen with no labels, but that's another very big question, because there was a poll from the Washington Post at the end of last year. It matched Trump and Biden. It found the close result, and then it re-polled the same voters, and it put several. It put RFK Jr., I think it put Joe Manchin just to test the name. I think it put the Libertarian candidate, maybe one other. It put them all in front of voters, and the third-party choices combined were getting something like 15% of the vote. When you see the negatives that Biden and Trump have, when you see the share of the voting population that says, I don't want either one of them, it takes me back. It mentioned 1992. George H.W. Bush, the incumbent president, his approval rating was in the 30s, and the economy was not in a good place. Bill Clinton emerged from the Democratic primaries with seemingly poisonously high personal unfavorable numbers. It created the atmosphere in which was born the Ross Perot phenomenon. And Ross Perot qualified for all the ballots. And go back, you can find the cover in Newsweek from June 1992. It says President Perot on it. He was leading as a third-party candidate the national polls in June of 1992. He dropped out over the summer, got back in the fall, finished with 20% of the vote. No electoral votes, but 20% of the vote. No one's matched that number or come close to it since. Could that be something that happens this year? And would that disproportionately affect one candidate or the other? Those are the questions I think we start to turn to now.
Oh, God. Steve, we were feeling a little agitation anyway. But if there's that many black boxes and those are the depths of the questions we've got to consider right away, we're going to have to take a break. More of our special coverage tonight from the New Hampshire primary and beyond. We're going to hear from our friends Claire McCaskill, Jen Palmieri when we come back. We've got lots still to get to. Stay with us.
With Donald Trump, Republicans have lost almost every competitive election. We lost the Senate. We lost the House. We lost the White House. We lost in 2018. We lost in 2020. And we lost in 2022. The worst kept secret in politics is how badly the Democrats want to run against Donald Trump.
Welcome back to our special coverage of the New Hampshire primary. The NBC News decision desk, excuse me, I'm glitching. The NBC News decision desk was able to project a very early win, basically a poll closing time win for President Biden in the Democratic presidential primary, and then it was about 11 and a half minutes later that the decision desk was able to project a New Hampshire Republican primary win for Donald Trump. But we have just obtained exclusively a statement from President Joe Biden on tonight's results in New Hampshire. This is a result he's given exclusively to us. You will not get this anywhere else. The president's statement is this: "It is now clear that Donald Trump will be the Republican nominee. And my message to the country is the stakes could not be higher. Our democracy, our personal freedoms, from the right to choose to the right to vote, our economy, which has seen the strongest recovery in the world since COVID, all are at stake." The president's statement continues: "I want to thank all those who wrote my name in this evening in New Hampshire. It was a historic demonstration of commitment to our democratic process. And I want to say to all those independents and Republicans who share our commitment to core values of our nation, our democracy, our personal freedoms, an economy that gives everyone a fair shot, to join us as Americans. Let's remember we are the United States of America, and there is nothing we cannot do if we do it together." Again, that statement exclusive from President Joe Biden to us here at NBC this evening. Lawrence.
Let's take a look at what Joe Biden was doing today. Today, the day after the 51st anniversary of the Roe v. Wade Supreme Court decision, President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris campaigned in Manassas, Virginia.
One does not have to abandon their faith or deeply held beliefs to agree the government should not be telling her what to do with her body.
Did anyone think that this is where America was going in 2024? Democracy is on the ballot. Freedom is on the ballot. Like the freedom to choose, the freedom to vote, the freedom to love who you want, the freedom to go to work, go to school, go to your house of worship without fear of being gunned down by a weapon of war.
Joining our discussion now, former Democratic Senator from Missouri, Claire McCaskill. Also with us, Jennifer Palmieri, former Obama White House Communications Director and former senior advisor to Hillary Clinton's 2016 presidential campaign. They co-host the MSNBC podcast, How to Win 2024. The perfect people to ask how to win 2024. Can we pause, Senator McCaskill, just for a second? On all those pundits who told us how disastrous it was for Joe Biden and the Democratic Party to bypass New Hampshire this year and start with South Carolina, a state that the party feels is more representative of Democratic voters. And what a disaster this was going to be for Joe Biden in New Hampshire and how he could actually end up losing in New Hampshire. It's worth a note to those pundits tonight about what actually happened there.
Yeah, I mean, and keep in mind, this was a little harder. They had a long list of names, and none of the names were Joe Biden. So for him to win a write-in effort like this, where the Biden campaign was not on the ground, they were not organizing, is quite a statement. And at the convention, I believe the New Hampshire delegates will be seated. I think Joe Biden is smart enough to know that it still is a swing state, and he needs to recognize those delegates eventually. But he felt it was important to take a stand about the first primary being in a more diverse state for a Democratic Party that prides itself on wanting to make sure that everybody is included in the American dream. Everybody, no matter who you are. So, listen, and I think you guys have gone over this, but he says he's the incumbent. You know, he calls himself the incumbent. He says he won. Well, when ever has an incumbent president only gotten 50% of his party's vote in the first two primaries? This is weakness. This is not strength.
Jen Palmieri, with all your experience at the highest level of presidential campaigns, what does the Biden-Harris campaign really want tonight? Do they want Nikki Haley to hang in there and keep hammering at Donald Trump and keep prying independent voters and possible Republican voters away from Donald Trump? Or do they want a clear shot at Donald Trump right now? The longer they get to go one-on-one with Donald Trump, the better.
They want both things, Lawrence. I think that's what they were telling us tonight. And it was very interesting that they put out that statement that said that Donald Trump is going to be the nominee. I think that the campaign has been operating and the White House has been operating as if the general election started on January 5th, right? That was the Valley Forge speech. I mean, so they are operating at general election speed. You see that even just they're getting pretty trolly in what they're saying about Donald Trump on the campaign's X account. You see them, and I think that they feel like they're getting some traction. They're getting some traction in the good economic news starting to take hold, and they're getting some traction on really training their fire on Trump. And I think they're telling us, don't take your eye off the ball. He is going to be the nominee. But it's also true that just in the last 2 weeks, we've learned a lot of valuable information from both the Iowa caucus and the New Hampshire Republican primary that'll be useful to the Biden campaign in the general election. For example, 30% of Republican Iowa caucus goers said that they would not vote for Trump if he was convicted. That number was over 40% in the Republican primary in New Hampshire. If she's taking swings at him as well, I don't know that it's not going to hurt him with Republicans. He's going to be the Republican nominee. But it's helpful to hear a Republican say bad things about Trump. I think that can help in the general election. And so this is not a case where Donald Trump is in any sort of danger. He's not taking on a lot of water in terms of securing the nomination. But I think with the campaign, so the campaign is happy for it to go on, continue to learn more from these competitive races. You learn a lot. It's really helpful. But signaling to everyone, keep focused on Trump. Don't get distracted by Haley.
Senator McCaskill, we heard a New Hampshire voter tonight who was voting for Nikki Haley, Republican voter, say, if it's Donald Trump versus Joe Biden in November, maybe I just won't vote. Now, mathematically, if that kind of Republican voter is placed in the right spots in the Electoral College in enough numbers, that could be enough for Joe Biden in those states if those otherwise Republican voters just don't vote.
As you well know, Lawrence, there's two parts of this. The first is persuasion. The second is enthusiasm. And if, in fact, he loses the enthusiasm of a huge chunk of his party, which it's clear he's going to, it doesn't matter as much if they vote for Biden as long as they don't vote. And I think that is going to be a reality. And listen, I think the other opportunity Nikki has, you guys went through all the congressmen and women who have endorsed her and all the governors and all the, the politicians are against Nikki Haley now. Donald Trump is the party of the elite. He is the party of Washington, D.C. Everybody in Washington, D.C. is for Donald Trump. That is really something she can use effectively against a lot of people in the Republican Party who Donald Trump has convinced that anything in Washington is the enemy.
Jen, as the Haley campaign goes on, whenever she's going in for her hardest attacks on Donald Trump, most of them, she tries to include Joe Biden in them, but some of them she doesn't. Some of them are just straight at Donald Trump. Does the Biden campaign get concerned about how much Nikki Haley mixes Biden into that attack?
I have noticed in this, just in this past couple of days, that she's dropped talking about Biden as much, and she's aiming her fire directly at Trump and Trump misspeaking and being confused and being older and the chaos and the negativity, and she's not connecting it to Biden. I mean, just like as a political person, I can tell you, trying to convince people that Joe Biden and Donald Trump are the same person appeals to no voter. So I think it's probably it's a bad priority. It was sort of a bad strategy for her to begin with. I don't think. I mean, if I were the Biden campaign, this is not something I would worry about. I would not worry about her making the same arguments about Trump and Biden, because again, voters are either for one of them or not. So they're not going to conflate the two. But it is interesting to me that she has started to focus more singularly on Trump. I mean, we'll see how long that lasts. She bought herself a ticket to South Carolina tonight. She did everything great. She came out early while Trump's lead wasn't that big. She had a good speech. She made the case for why she should stay in. She's gaining ground. She did better this week than last week. Why would she drop out? South Carolina is one state away. That's her home state. We don't think she's going to win it, but this is a reason for her to stay in. She picked a fight with Trump over debates. So she did the things just sort of tactically that you should do to stay in. And we'll see where she goes from here, but she's not going to be the nominee. But she bought herself she handled it well and bought herself the ability to continue to fight for 2 more states.
There's nothing like hearing from campaign professionals. Jen Palmieri, Claire McCaskill, co-hosts of the MSNBC podcast, How to Win in 2024.
Again, the news that we led this segment with, I don't want to go unnoticed, which is that President Biden has given us an exclusive statement in response to the New Hampshire primary results tonight. He said, "It is now clear that Donald Trump will be the Republican nominee. My message to the country is the stakes could not be higher. Our democracy, our personal freedoms from the right to choose to the right to vote, our economy, which has seen the strongest recovery in the world since COVID, all are at stake." He then says, "I want to thank all those who wrote my name in this evening in New Hampshire. It was a historic demonstration of commitment to our democratic process." Our democracy being at stake and the commitment to our democratic process represented by people writing in the president's name in a contest in which he was not formally competing, it is awkward. And some of that awkwardness is about to get way worse in what is shaping up to be a general election contest between President Biden and former President Trump. We've got that story ahead for you next. Stay with us. So on the Republican campaign schedule this year, you guys, there were supposed to be 2 debates after Iowa and before the New Hampshire primary. Remember that? We all blocked it out on our calendars. We all planned to be here. This was one of the things that was going to happen. It was awkward because they were only a few days apart, but there's only 8 days between Iowa and New Hampshire. They were going to squeeze in 2 debates between Iowa and New Hampshire. 2 more chances for the candidates to make final appeals to New Hampshire voters before the polls opened in New Hampshire today. Did those happen?
No.
They did not. No, they did not. Those debates did not happen because Donald Trump is refusing to debate this year. Nikki Haley said it would be pointless to hold another debate without Trump when, in her words, Ron DeSantis was closer to 0 than he was to her. So why would she bother talking to him? This is sort of a fair point, but that does mean there were no New Hampshire debates at all. Now, my in-laws live in New Hampshire. I have lots of family and lots of acquaintances in New Hampshire. I spend lots of time in New Hampshire. I did not expect to hear this, but I did anecdotally hear a lot of people say that they were mad there were no New Hampshire debates. I mean, the Republican primary debates, none of them included the frontrunner, none of them included Trump, but they were in like Wisconsin and Florida and California, and none of them were in New Hampshire because there were supposedly going to be these two dedicated New Hampshire debates, both of them off. And so people in New Hampshire, at least anecdotally in my experience, were mad about that. But more broadly, that is becoming kind of a theme this year. I mean, more so than at any time since the Civil War, this is the election in which we're deciding whether or not to keep a democracy. But there's not very much democracy in this contest thus far, right? With an incumbent president, which is true anytime you have an incumbent president, there's no real primary on the Democratic side. It may be the shortest primary ever on the Republican side, which is what we've been talking to Steve Kornacki about all night. Supporters of the frontrunner are emphatically demanding that everybody has to clear the field so we can stop with all this darn voting. The voting is so offensive. We've got no debates for the Democratic nominee. We've got no debates for the likely Republican nominee. Very possibly, we've got no general election debates at all because neither Trump nor Biden has debated thus far. Neither of them seems to want to. And so why would they? We are now in a fight to save democracy in this country, but we are trying to fight for it without using democracy to fight for it, which is, I don't know. I mean, it feels historically unprecedented, but if there's one thing we've learned, nothing is. Joining us now is NBC News presidential historian Michael Beschloss. Michael, we're so happy to have you with us tonight. Thank you so much for joining us.
Me too. Thank you, Rachel.
The lack of democracy in this democratic process does feel a little bit circumstantial. There are different reasons for it on the Democratic side than on the Republican side. However that may be, they're combining to give us a process in which everybody's talking about the fight for democracy, and it does feel like not a very democratic process this time.
No, that's exactly right. And you have written, for instance, about the fact that there was a suggestion in 1940 and 1944 that Franklin Roosevelt, because there was a war on, perhaps should appeal to suspend elections so that the country would benefit. And Roosevelt said, you know, the best way of deciding on a president and a Congress is more democracy, not less. And, you know, the other thing, Rachel, you know, just to make people feel a little bit better about this, if Donald Trump tied up the Republican nomination for president tonight for 2024, and he probably did, let's ask the question, did the Republicans get their strongest candidate to run against Joe Biden? I don't think so. The polls suggest that Nikki Haley would be a much stronger candidate than Donald Trump. So one way you look at a process is to say, does it include enough, you know, states and voters coming in on this so that it's a real judgment? The answer in this case would be no. You know, this is after Iowa and New Hampshire. They have decided who's going to lock up one of the nominations of the two major parties if it is locked up tonight or in the next few weeks. The other thing is you want a process that's going to get you the candidate who has at least a great chance to win. And the Republicans have not done this. You've got someone who has had this cornucopia of forthcoming trials and indictments, someone who has promised, just as you've said, Rachel, to suspend the Constitution and institute essentially a presidential dictatorship if he's elected. That's not going to be necessarily a great vote getter in a fall presidential election. And the other thing is that, you know, this is not someone who's exactly the most self-disciplined candidate the Republicans could have for the presidency. Look at the way he's been talking during the last week. He's not in control of what he says. He confuses Nancy Pelosi with Nikki Haley. He makes other mistakes that seem to be getting more rather than less. If I were a Republican, which I'm not, I would say this has ended too quickly and has saddled us with a candidate who may turn out to be unelectable.
Michael, if we're also atrophying the muscle that is debating, presidential debating. If we lose presidential debates, and we lose it on the Democratic side this time because you got an incumbent president, you often lose it in that circumstance. We lost it on the Republican side because there's a pseudo-incumbent Republican who's decided to sort of take that privilege for himself and refuse to debate. Both of those nominees, or likely nominees, don't seem to want to debate for the general. If we lose presidential debates in this cycle, what are we losing as a country?
We're losing a lot, because what we had demanded as a country in 1960 and since beginning in 1976, when the tradition was resumed, at least in the fall, and also in most of those years during primary campaigns, we have demanded of potential candidates, we want to see what you're like when you're out of your comfort zone. And out of your comfort zone doesn't mean submitting to a softball interview on Fox News. It means going into a debate when someone who is running against you and wants the same job, takes a few cracks at you and tries to knock you off your feet. Let's see how well you're able to maintain yourself. That's a crucial requirement of whoever is going to be the next president at a time that's going to be very difficult in this country and difficult around the world.
Michael, it's Alex Wagner. We talk about whether or not there's a historical precedent for any of this, and it seems like what Trump is trying to do is fairly singular in terms of modern American politics. Correct me if I'm wrong, but the last guy to try to do this and succeed at it was Grover Cleveland. Is that right? And if it is right, is there anything analogous to in terms of where the country was at or where the parties were at then and where they are at now?
Well, I think maybe 1912, where, as you know, Theodore Roosevelt, who had been president, ran for president again, first lost the Republican nomination, and then ran as a progressive in the fall and got a huge number of votes. Although he did not win, he was a spoiler and allowed Woodrow Wilson to be elected with a pretty slim share of the vote in the low 40s. And you see where I'm going, which is that if we're in a situation where there are third parties or third movements like what I consider the egregious no labels or Robert Kennedy Jr. or some of these others who chip away at a direct confrontation between Joe Biden and Donald Trump, we could wind up with results that really don't reflect the thinking of the American people, because it could be that someone could be elected with a much narrower sliver of the vote, just as Wilson was in 1912. I have not too much doubt that if you have a direct conflict between Joe Biden and Donald Trump has a harder time winning. On the other hand, if you have spoiler candidates or movements who chip off various pieces of what might otherwise be Joe Biden's vote, you could have a situation like 2000, where Al Gore was probably defeated by third movements, by people like Ralph Nader, or other cases in history like 2016, where Jill Stein and others chipped off what might have been Hillary Clinton's ability to win the Electoral College.
NBC News presidential historian Michael Beschloss. Michael, it is fantastic to have you here, always, but particularly tonight. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. Always love being together, Rachel.
Indeed. All right. Well, it has been a remarkable night thus far. Again, we got a projection at poll closing from the NBC News decision desk of President Biden, who was not on the ballot, winning the Democratic presidential primary in New Hampshire. 11 minutes later, we got a projection of Donald Trump winning the Republican presidential primary in New Hampshire. Nikki Haley saying she will not get out. The political class saying all the things the political class usually says. But there's a lot still to absorb here. We've got more to come. Our MSNBC special coverage of the New Hampshire primary continues right after this. Stay with us.
And welcome back to our special coverage of tonight's presidential primaries in New Hampshire. I'm Chris Hayes here at MSNBC headquarters in New York. I'm here along with Stephanie Ruhle, Joy Reid, Ari Milber, and Alex Wagner. We are just just 11 minutes. We are not just 11 minutes, but just 11 minutes after the polls closed earlier tonight. NBC News was able to project that Donald Trump would be the winner of the New Hampshire primary. Right now, with 60% of the vote counted, Trump is leading Nikki Haley, as you see there on the bottom of your screen, by about 11 points. Nikki Haley took to the stage almost immediately after Trump was projected to be the winner, an early appearance on an evening where it was clear she was not going to pull out an outright victory. She was defiant. She seemed like a candidate who wanted to make sure everyone knew that she would not be going anywhere, that she told the crowd she's staying in the race. And there's now a month until the next Republican primary contest, which just happens to be in her home state, the state of which she was the governor, South Carolina. Donald Trump also gave a speech tonight in which he claimed to have won New Hampshire in the last two general elections. He did not. Lost it narrowly in 2016 and lost it by 7 points in 2020. He also seemed really angry and at Nikki Haley. Spent a lot of time attacking her. At one point, he put a minute on the clock for Vivek Ramaswamy to come in and attack her. At one point, he seemed to suggest she might soon be under investigation for, and I quote here, stuff she doesn't want to talk about. On the Democratic side, Joe Biden is the projected winner of tonight's primary. Now, that may not be surprising. He is, after all, the incumbent president. But this was a very strange year. Joe Biden was not on the ballot in New Hampshire. The Democratic Party, under Joe Biden's guidance, really decided that the first primary for the Democratic Party should be in the state of South Carolina this year. That'll happen in a month. New Hampshire Democrats, who take very seriously their first in the nation status, rebelled and decided to defy the party and hold their primary first anyway, even though no delegates would be awarded. So the Democratic primary doesn't count ultimately for the nomination. So Biden supporters had to organize a write-in campaign. And as you can see there, that did not prove to be a problem. He is winning handily against his primary challengers. Let's head over to Steve Kornacki at the big board, who, of course, been watching those returns come in. It looks in the 10-11 range, which, again, it's sort of interesting because it seems like it's in line with Iowa, where it's not unexpected. It's about within the range, maybe a little closer than the last polling average showed, but nothing shocking.
I think that's right. I think what happened is the way the night played out, just based on what we saw in the initial exit polls. And if folks were watching at the start of the night, literally the first three towns, really they were cities, that reported, just so happened, now that all of this is filled in on the map, just so happen to be the three best Haley cities in the state. They're the only three where she's really hitting the numbers she'd need to be hitting to compete statewide. And what happened after, it just so happened, those were the first three. And after that, we started to see some pretty clear patterns emerge, which is she's underperformed what she would need to do in places where she's supposed to be strong. A great example is right here in Nashua. This is the state's second largest city. Again, on a night where she's competitive and winning statewide, she's winning Nashua by 5 points, by 10 points, really. Trump is going to end up winning Nashua here. That was not what the Haley campaign had in mind at all. Manchester, the state's largest city. Look at this. Trump's going to win it by 16 points. Again, this is one where Haley needed to basically be running even with him. And I'm showing you cities here, but if we started doing small town after small town, Haley was running even worse under where she needed to be running. So, what's left on this map? Haley is going to pick up votes right in these four counties. These were basically Trump's worst, some of his worst. This was his towns. This was Trump's worst town, Hanover in 2016, City of Lebanon, Lyme, Orford. You can expect big Haley numbers here. We have yet to get numbers right here. This is Durham, where the State University of New Hampshire is, the home of the Wildcats. Exeter, a school town, Exeter Academy is there. You can expect Haley to pick up some ground there. But what's left in terms of Trump voters, some big places where we expect he's going to get some very big margins. Chief among them, Salem. Salem was one of his best towns in the state in 2016. Look at this. He got 48%. Salem is the sixth largest town or city in the state of New Hampshire. We expect this to go very big for Donald Trump tonight. Next door in Pelham. This you can also expect is going to be a big Trump margin. Look, we've got Londonderry, and this is one Haley wanted to win. She ends up losing it by 1,000 points. And Londonderry was supposed to be much better for her than next door, another one of the largest towns in the state, Derry. We have no vote from Derry, but I think based on what we're seeing, we can expect an awfully big number for Trump. Trump here. You go across, look at the border town of Seabrook here, right on 95. It's the first town you're going to hit in New Hampshire if you're going north. And I mean, again, look at this. No surprise that Trump wins it, but this is, look at that, 44 points. This is a bigger margin than Haley was certainly hoping to hold him to. So what it means, really, Chris, is I think with 62% in, it's very possible, bordering on likely, this is going to end up being a double-digit victory for Donald Trump tonight. And more to the point, it's not just a double-digit victory, but it's this. When you just look at the exit poll here, I got to scroll to the last one here, but when you break it down by party, I mean, this is it. Look, Republicans, Trump 74, Haley 25. Haley lost Republicans by essentially 50 points tonight, 5-0. What kept this thing, what's going to keep her about 10 points behind, is that among independents, this is the third wave data now, she has a 22-point advantage over Trump. And an unusually high number of Democrats participated. And look at that, 88.5, Haley over Trump here. So this was a mix, though. You know, an electorate that's basically 50-50, Republicans, non-Republicans. That's as good as it's going to get for Nikki Haley anywhere. And she's still very potentially going to, a double-digit loss very much could be in the cards for here. So if that happens with that demographic mix, I know South Carolina is her home state. I know she says she's taking the campaign down there. But if you took the best election ever put it this way, the biggest share of the primary electorate that non-Republicans have ever had in a South Carolina primary, you got to go back for 2000 for that. If you match that up with the results in New Hampshire, it would translate into a Trump win of 15 points. So it just, again, it is hard to see where she could go from this, despite the fact that this was a little closer than expected, especially early in the night. When you're losing Republicans by 50 points, not many Republican primaries you can win.
Yeah, I'm not the Kornacki at this network, but even I can understand that you've got to win Republicans to win a Republican primary. Steve Kornacki, thank you very much. Joining us now from Manchester, New Hampshire is NBC News correspondent Ali Vitale and NBC News correspondent Vaughn Hilliard. They've been traveling with those two campaigns. Ali, I want to start with you on what you thought of the message sent by Haley's speech tonight and what tomorrow for the Nikki Haley campaign looks like.
I'll start with the speech because there were a few things that struck me, Chris, specifically the way that Haley was saying, basically with open arms, hey, if you're like me and you voted for Trump twice and you liked his policies but you hated the chaos, come have a home with me as the alternative. That was the clear overarching message here, and it was on her biggest stage yet in which she had to deliver it. So I do think that that's important as we head into South Carolina, which Haley is no fool. She knows that state better than almost anybody. She's aware of the fact that it's changed demographically and ideologically since she last ran statewide on that ticket. Nevertheless, it's what's next in the calendar, and it is her home state. Those are things she can't change, so she's forging right ahead. Here's what I think was smart tonight. I think that coming out early when the results looked way closer than they do now allowed them to use this as an energizer and a momentum builder. That was a shrewd political move, and we've seen it before. It made me think, frankly, of 2020 when Amy Klobuchar came in, 5th in Iowa, but came out early and said, yeah, that's a win for me. I'm out of here and on to New Hampshire. That's what this felt like here for Nikki Haley, saying this was good enough. She never was going to win. The campaign never said she was going to, although some of her surrogates initially said it would be a landslide for her and then had to taper that back. But both of those things were striking to me. I do think there were two things that also struck my attention with Trump. The anger, you're absolutely right to point out. He wears it on his sleeve. He was trying to rub the fact that he's got a South Carolina senator who Haley appointed to his seat in the first place in Tim Scott, standing not just with him as an endorser, but physically, literally with him over his shoulder, at one point referencing the fact that Tim Scott must really hate Nikki Haley in order to endorse Donald Trump in the fashion that he did. Scott tried to parry and say, no, it's just because I love you. But again, this is the kind of thing that Trump is going to do. We all know what it is when he turns his fire on someone. We saw what it did to Ron DeSantis. Now, Nikki Haley is the only person left there. There was one final thing, though, that I think we sort of have to remark upon, because to me, there were so many layers to that Trump remarks session that we saw at the end of the night. Just the way that Nikki Haley talks about the rest of the field as the fellas, there's so many different gender dynamics involved in that statement. But when you look at that stage and Trump trying to give everyone a chance to go after her,
it literally looked like the boys club trying to tell the woman to get out of the way. Now, there's a lot of political reasons that they're saying that, but it didn't necessarily only come off that way. There was politics plus on that stage tonight, and to me, it felt almost unignorable, the optics part of it.
Well, I totally agree about the optics, which were unignorable. Vaughn, let me ask you, so a development we've seen tonight, we've seen a few, if I'm not mistaken, U.S. senators. John Cornyn of Texas, I believe Deb Fischer as well, have come forward to endorse Trump. They had been withholding them. It seems very clear to me there is going to be an orchestrated and coordinated attempt from the Trump campaign to basically, you know, create a drumbeat tomorrow. Is that what you're expecting from the campaign and Republican politicians tomorrow?
Absolutely, and we already heard from RNC Chair Ronna McDaniel shortly before the polls closed here tonight that if Donald Trump in fact won tonight, that this was a time for the Republican Party to all but unite and look toward Joe Biden and the Democrats in November, because the Trump campaign, several senior advisors over the weekend insisting that this is the moment where resources specifically should be directed toward November, as the Democrats are all but stockpiling their cash awaiting Donald Trump. This is a moment where they don't want to have to waste cash over the next month waiting for that South Carolina primary a month from now to play out. Now, I mean, to give you an idea, so far, $2 million have been invested in reserve TV ads by Haley allies in South Carolina. There is no reserve TV ad spending from Donald Trump, but clearly Nikki Haley tonight indicating that she wants to go mano a mano in a debate against Donald Trump, and she wants to make a fight out of this. And so the question for the Trump campaign tomorrow is, do they actually expend resources and energy trying to take her on? You heard Donald Trump on that stage tonight suggest that if Nikki Haley were to become president, that Democrats would be investigating her for things that he is yet to disclose himself. Of course, these are red herrings in which he has absolutely no evidence or no specifics of, and we have seen him have a history of doing this in the past. But for Donald Trump, he views this very much as a nuisance. He feels like this is a Republican Party that is unifying around him, not only Ron DeSantis, but Vivek Ramaswamy, Tim Scott behind him on stage. You see members of Congress, more than half of the U.S. House delegation, Republicans, have backed his candidacy, and now Republicans who have even suggested and scrutinized his candidacy here in 2024, like John Cornyn, are now rallying around him with the full understanding that the map for Nikki Haley looks extremely difficult, especially in some of those closed primary states like California, where independents, Democrats can't take part in the Republican primary. And if Donald Trump gets more than 50% of the vote in that state, he takes all of the delegate share. This is going to be a very difficult path for Nikki Haley.
All right, NBC's Helen Vitale and Vaughn Hilliard, thank you both. I'm curious to see, so we saw the Cornyn tweet tonight. You're gonna try to create this, like, let's wrap it up. And it's just going to be an interesting dynamic, because so much of this comes down to these sort of human calculations of interests and incentives. And every time they all go the same way, which is that they all just fold, right? Yeah. And they don't just fold because he won't just accept you folding. You have to, like, prostrate yourself to him. You have to humiliate. I mean, the Tim Scott moment tonight was actually, like deeply humiliating on purpose. And so the question now, to Allie's point about the sort of boys club, is like, it's at one level, fate will be determined by a calculation of interest by Nikki Haley, but also what kind of person she is under these circumstances, which is like, I don't know if she's going to make it a month, because they're going to do everything they can to make sure she doesn't. But
yes. I mean, I hate to keep beating this drum, but it's going to be bare knuckle, full-on brawl with the force of a movement that has shown itself to stop at literally nothing in terms of character assassination, right? I mean, and also we talk about Nikki Haley's recent days of sort of taking on Trump as maybe addled or cognitively in decline, but you know, she's still assailing him on personality characteristics, traits. Rightly or wrongly, chaos follows him. He's pushing 80, he's not all there. Right. Never, ever does she go for any substantive critique of a man who incited an insurrection, who stole classified documents, who has 91 felony counts against him. I mean, there are substantive issues she could take up with Donald Trump if she so chose, but she's not going to, because she's constantly making this sort of impossible arithmetic work for her until the next day.
But she made valid points tonight. I mean, in her speech, she said he's not winning. She said, we lost the White House, we lost the Senate, we lost the House. In 18, in 20, in 22, we lost. It's time to win. So she's not hitting him between the eyes, but she's making an argument while Joe Biden is sitting in the White House with an economy that's improving, with Donald Trump hasn't even faced his maker with these 91 charges, and Nikki Haley's saying, I don't know, how about this? And she's got the money.
And she has absolutely nothing to lose by staying in, and Joe Biden has everything to gain from her being there. But I think the point that you made that I think is substantively, we have to address it, and Republicans at some point have to think about it. Donald Trump is running for re-election for no reason other than that he wishes to, that he would like to stay out of prison.
Well, I was going to say
that he would like to, that it is his only way of ensuring that he doesn't go to prison. And an entire political party that one would think would have at least some rational goals has decided that that is enough for them. The John Cornyn's of the world, the Mitch McConnell, no one is fighting this, despite the fact that he has never delivered to them victory other than his own victory when he beat Hillary Clinton. After that, he has delivered to them losses of historic nature. They could have, in a normal election cycle, won a huge midterm in the last midterm. They didn't, because they used his candidates, his themes, his grievances, and his triumph in the Supreme Court of snatching the bodily autonomy of 50% of the American population. And they're literally going to go willingly back into that stockade and lock themselves in with Donald Trump again, not because they have to, but because they've chosen to, because they don't have the courage to not do it. And it is fascinating to me to watch a political party make the decision to self-destruct on purpose, to go down with the man who has delivered them the greatest and most historic defeats that one could have in the modern era, and who is also promising to deliver an autocracy.
Although I'll just say, and I'll go to you, Ari, is that, you know, she says, she makes the argument, all he does is lose. He had a line tonight which I thought was interesting, right? Which is like, it's like, who couldn't beat Biden, right? And one of the things I think that's important here is...
You.
Right. Well, the answer is, I have an answer, ding, 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 Donald Trump. But number two is that it really is the case, and this is an important aspect of this, I think, Joy, is that Biden is portrayed as so obviously weak in the conservative media in which most of these voters are operating, and the polling shows Donald Trump about even with him, that they're not that freaked out, the Republican voters. They really, like, they don't see some big...
Well, they don't think he was unpopular before the last two midterms.
Yeah, right.
Red wave never
No,
came.
I'm not saying they're right. I'm just saying I remember the psychology of liberals in 2004 when George W. Bush was the incumbent president, and it was completely different. There was this sense that, like, Bush was a colossus. And so the voter psychology in that primary in 2004 was we need someone to go up against this colossus because we've lost touch with the country, and he's powerful, and he's a wartime president, and there was this sort of, like, defensive crouch. You don't see that in the Republican Party. You don't see it in the exit polling.
But you know why you don't see it, Chris? Because they don't believe he lost.
Well, exactly.
Like, they actually don't accept that he lost the election. And they've decided to... He knows that he lost, but, I mean, they've decided that they're so fearful of their base that does not believe he lost the election, that they're not going to fight them. They're going to keep giving them what they want until, I guess, the party collapses on itself.
And I think the turning point there is we saw the Trump wing and President Biden both come out tonight and say, looks like it's Trump. Which tells you something funny sometimes when that happens in politics. We've spoken about so many of Trump's limitations. I do think one thing that he has going for him is how he did dispatch so many of the other candidates. And to me, up to this point, Haley is a little different, and we'll see whether she gets tougher, as Alex was saying. But with all the other candidates, he did do something effective, and it does, for me, bring to mind Drake, who said, thought we was enemies, but the big U is like a mini me. And these were mini-me's.
So weird. I was thinking that same thing.
Right? It comes right to the mind. But they were mini-me's at the time because they were trying to channel him even as he clobbered them. DeSantis and Vivek, when they ran into any static, said there must be some confusion because we want to be him. And then tonight we have the extremely unusual. I don't even call it strange because I guess it depends on what you like. But politically unusual thing of someone winning a second state and being like, here, let me hand it off. But you come do some dirty work. And so I think the real question for Haley is, does she pivot out of being a rejected wannabe mini-me and say, I actually can be the future of the party and find some magic?
Is she going to be groveling within the next 36 hours? Up next, Obama campaign manager David Plouffe and my colleague Simone Sanders Townsend. We'll be right back. Don't go anywhere.
The other day, Donald Trump accused me of not providing security at the Capitol on January 6th. Now, I've long called for mental competency tests for politicians over the age of 75. Trump claims he'd do better than me in one of those tests. Maybe he would. Maybe he wouldn't. But if he thinks that, then he should have no problem standing on a debate stage with me.
So you heard Nikki Haley call attention to this in her speech tonight. Donald Trump has raised eyebrows recently for garbling basic facts and confusing one political rival for another. Take a look at this.
We have become a drug-infested, crime-ridden nation, which is incapable of solving even the smallest problem. We are an institute and a powerful death penalty. Ding, 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 ding. They've only got 17 seconds to figure this whole thing out, right? Boom. Okay. Missile launch. Pshing, boom. Obama dropped missiles and they ended up hitting a kindergarten. If that's the case, he's going to end up being indicted when he leaves office. Nikki Haley is in charge of security. We offered her 10,000 people, soldiers, National Guard, so whatever they want. They turned it down. They were funding Hezbollah and Hamas. When I came here, everyone thought Bush was going to win. They thought Bush because Bush supposedly was a military person. Great. You know what? He was a military. He got us into the Middle East. With Obama, we won an election that everyone said couldn't be won. We would be in World War II very quickly if we're going to be relying on this man.
Yes, that was Donald Trump, who won the New Hampshire primary tonight. So let's bring in former Obama campaign manager David Plouffe and Simone Sanders Townsend, former chief spokesperson for Vice President Harris and former senior advisor to Biden's 2020 presidential campaign. But you know her, of course, as the co-host of The Weekend right here on MSNBC. Simone, Donald Trump, love him or hate him, he's an effective politician and he is an expert when it comes to messaging. He won Iowa and New Hampshire day in and day out by spreading lies about the economy, about immigration, about crime. It's worked. But now how is this plan going to work in the election, in the general election?
Well, Steph, I think two things. First, I think part of how he won Iowa and, frankly, New Hampshire is that there are a large number of the primary voters within the Republican Party apparatus who have been dedicated to Donald Trump. Like, think about it. In 2016, about 180,000 people went out and voted in that primary in Iowa, in the caucus. And then fast forward to this year, it was about 110,000. So, and then I've been watching Steve Kornacki all evening, looking at the big board about the makeup of the electorate in New Hampshire. And so I would just note that the American people, and someone said this to me recently, back when Donald Trump was president, the COVID briefings were the best thing that happened to the American people because they could see for themselves and hear for themselves directly from Donald Trump and his administration about what they were doing and saying. And then folks like us came on, y'all came on air, gave the context, and they could make their own decisions. Well, what you just played, I know there are many people who are watching right now who were watching with their mouths wide open because they had never heard that before. And so hearing Donald Trump in his own words, I think is going to be very important for the American people and the voters when they make these decisions, because right now they are hearing a lot of editorializing about what Donald Trump said and not hearing Donald Trump. So it's hard for them to believe, I think. But I like to say, you know, when people tell you who they are, believe them, and I take the former president at his word.
David, when the Biden campaign looks at the results from tonight, Donald Trump being both the strongest and most vulnerable he has ever been, what's their game plan to win over those Nikki Haley voters?
Well, Stephanie, that was a key part of how Joe Biden won last time was he did well enough with Republican voters and just importantly, independents who basically behave politically like Republicans. What this provides, you saw in Iowa, New Hampshire, we're almost 50% in both states. As this primary continues, it's going to reveal more and more targets for the Biden campaign, the type of Republican voters and the type of independent voters who don't want to sign up for another Trump 4 years. So from a modeling and data standpoint, it's important. And then there's his behavior. Listen, it is really hard to screw up a victory speech in politics. And that's what Donald Trump did tonight. And I guarantee you that was not the plan. They had a speech in a teleprompter. In a Trump-like way, it was probably going to be magnanimous. And Haley made him angry. And Sue reacted that way. You got to think about Trump. There's kind of a psyops notion of running against him. Like, how do you destabilize him? And I think that was revealing. And then I think that montage you just showed, first of all, he looks horrible. Like, what's going on with the makeup? This guy does not look well. And those clips you just showed, I'm sure the Biden campaign is going to make sure every voter in the 6 or 7 states that will determine his presidency will see those, and there's going to be a lot more. And so I think that what this does show, if I was running a campaign, I'd say, listen, there's 40 to 45% of Republicans in every state. Most of them will vote for Trump. But we can go communicate to them on the economy, on democracy, on abortion, on Trump's, instability. So it's a really, really rich thing to build that kind of data model that these primaries are revealing is available potentially to the Biden campaign.
David, why do you think Nikki Haley wants to stay in this race? We've been debating it over the last hour. Yes, she potentially has the money. She could imprint in Republican voters' minds that she was the last person standing. But the longer she stays in, the longer she goes after Trump, she will then be a target of his. And that's not a nice place to be, especially if you're a Republican.
No, it does take a strong constitution, Stephanie. But I think, now listen, I wish the things she was saying tonight, through this week in New Hampshire, she should have been saying them in the whole campaign. She basically didn't take on Trump till it's too late. So, Trump's going to be the Republican nominee. I think from Haley's standpoint, one, I think she wants to probably see, by the way, Trump's speech tonight, if you could call it that, is definitely going to be ammunition for Haley to stay in. But, could there be a health issue? My sense is if he were to get convicted, that doesn't hurt him in the Republican primary. It hurts him in the general. So I think she kind of wants to hang around, maybe get some delegates on Super Tuesday in case something happens. It's going to take a strong constitution. But this is another reason why it was malpractice. I mean, to the extent that Haley, and I'm sure she is having lots of people today, maybe not her donors, but a lot of Republicans saying, you got to get out, you got to get out. That kind of speech and those attacks. I mean, Trump basically said if Haley stays in, she's going to get investigated. That is not going to motivate Haley to get out.
Simone, I want to go back to messaging because it's what you are so very good at. Donald Trump still speaks to this base, this forgotten American, the little guy who feels left out, even though he never delivered on policy. Somehow his message, he makes that voter feel seen. Joe Biden's policies actually deliver for those voters, right? Forgiving student debt, lowering prescription drug prices, making sure more Americans have health coverage. What is your advice to get to those voters? Or why do those voters still stand with Trump? Just the grievance party?
Well, look, there is, and as Pluff just noted, there is a segment of folks who supported Donald Trump in 2016 and 2020 who will also support him in 2024. Those are not gettable Biden voters. The Biden coalition that was put together in 2020, yes, included independents, it included some moderate Republicans, and it included the entirety of the Democratic base. All of the Republicans that they want can defect from Donald Trump. Without the base of the Democratic Party, Joe Biden does not get reelected. And so there is I think it's just really important to understand that is the coalition. So some of those folks, no matter what President Biden says, they will not vote for him. But it is important to make sure you are speaking to the totality of the potential of your coalition. And I cannot underscore that I cannot underscore that enough, a little bold and underlined. And so you've seen the president do things like today, the first big campaign rally. He, Vice President Harris, the second gentleman, Dr. Biden, the first lady, they were all in Virginia at a rally. Democrats in Virginia literally swept the tables in their recent elections on the issue of reproductive freedom and abortion. Literally, they now are in charge of the state Senate and the House of Delegates, all because of this issue of abortion and reproductive freedom. This is something that Vice President Harris has been really leading on and leaning in on throughout the last year and a half, I would argue, and it's something that is going to be key to the Biden reelection. Abortion is an economic issue. So yes, you have to talk about the numbers in the economy, but you have to meet people where they are, go into their communities. And look, I think Joe Biden is a very prolific campaigner. I've seen him out there on the campaign trail. He echoes, I think, what people say about President Clinton in terms of the way that he campaigns. You got to let Joe Biden get out there and campaign and be Joe Biden. That's what he does best. Not these teleprompter speeches with the flags behind him. Put Joe Biden with the people. That's where he really wants to be.
All right, then. Simone Sanders Townsend, David Plouffe, thank you so much. Chris?
There is a reason Donald Trump has made presidential immunity. Have you heard that phrase? Big part of his campaign. 91 criminal charges will do that to you when you're running for president. Trump is also turning his court cases into campaign opportunities. That story is next. So one notable thing about Donald Trump's win in today's New Hampshire primary, also true for Iowa a week ago, is he didn't spend a ton of time campaigning in New Hampshire. Instead, the ex-president spent much of the week leading up to the primary somewhere where he spent a lot of time recently in a courtroom. Specifically, he was in a New York courtroom for a defamation trial that will determine how much more money he has to pay the writer E. Jean Carroll. A jury is already, after a full civil trial, and evidence and arguments, has already ordered Trump to pay her millions of dollars for sexually abusing and defaming her, saying she was a liar when she came forward with her account of him raping her. This current trial is just to figure out how much more money he has to pay. Now, to be clear, it's a civil proceeding. Trump doesn't have to be at these hearings, just like he didn't have to attend the fraud trial of his family business in person, another civil trial, but he did. He apparently decided being in court is a great way to campaign for the Republican nomination for president, also a good way to raise money. But of course, the Trump court cases, civil and criminal, are not just campaign stops. There will ultimately be verdicts in these cases. There may yet be more Trump trials before the November election, crucially criminal as opposed to civil, and polls show there is a significant number of Trump voters who say they will not vote for him if he is criminally convicted. We've got exit polling, Ari, on this in 2 states, a kind of 2/3, 1/3 split in Iowa about fitness for president, 1/3 saying they wouldn't view him as fit. And then tonight in New Hampshire, a 54-42, 42% saying they wouldn't find him as fit. Do you believe those polls?
I believe they reflect something. And that something is non-zero, and as our whole panel has discussed, Donald Trump has lost a bunch of times. So if that reflects that 5 or 10% in any electorate in an independent state say, yeah, I still don't like the idea of a convict president, the crimes are unpopular. We've seen this in both parties, by the way. Yes, Trump is a little different, but Blagojevich was known to be unruly and weird and wild and a reality show star in Illinois, and the Democratic electorate there put up with that for a long time. When he was indicted for trying to hawk and sell President-elect Obama's Senate seat, people turned on him before the conviction, and the conviction made it worse, and then it was moot because he spent a lot of time in prison. The fact that he was pardoned by Donald Trump is a story for another day, Chris. So I think that being a criminal is unpopular, and being indicted with overwhelming evidence, where, yes, we say legally you're presumed innocent, but it doesn't mean we can't, as a country, look at the evidence. And then second, what is the Donald Trump campaign strategy? Crooked Hillary, crime family Biden, Hunter Biden connected back to dad, James Comey letters on Hillary. They know, and they live by, in multiple elections, a Ukrainian investigation, I forgot to throw that in there. They know that accusing your opponent of having criminal problems hurts them. And this, I believe, is likely to continue to hurt him unless he actually gets an acquittal or mistrial and beats the case and is able to flip that evidence argument.
Yeah, go ahead, Alex.
Well, I was just going to say there's so many X factors related to it, and we were trying to drill into this with Garrett Hake in Iowa. Like, what's the crime they believe that is disqualifying? Because we have a fair idea, given the 91 felony counts. And then there's the spin, there's the obfuscation, there's the fact that Trump is going to say Biden did this and worse. He's already suggesting Nikki Haley may be under investigation for something. I mean, you know, I want to believe that you know, being guilty of a felony is disqualifying, and that the American public believes that as well, just for the sake of democracy. But when it comes down to brass tacks, A, are we going to actually have a trial before the election? Will he be convicted? What is the appeals process going to be like that? There's so many unknowns. It's hard to to put too much of an emphasis on this sort of being the get out of jail.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think, it's not the sort of deus ex machina that, like, finally ends Trump. Although I also think that people undercount, to your point about the difference between even being, you know, investigated, being indicted, and having a jury find you guilty. I do think there's a kind of seismic political impact to that and in the perception of the American public. But then at the same time, one of the things, Joy, that has made this so weird is, here you've got a guy who, there was a trial in a New York City courtroom with a jury of his peers with evidence. It was not guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. It was a preponderance of the evidence thresholds for a civil trial, in which a woman said, this man raped me in a dressing room, sexually forced himself on me, and then lied about me lying. And they found him civilly liable for that sexual abuse. And again, take a step back. Obviously, any other candidate is toast after that happens. Of course. And wouldn't be going to the trial to highlight it as, would not be like voluntarily bringing attention to it.
Yeah, but I mean, the thing is, Donald Trump has been very skillful. I mean, you think about the Hillary Clinton example. The reason that it was so effective for him is that it neutralized in people's minds his own guilt, right? It made, if everyone's doing it, then no one doing it is especially bad.
Yes, right, yeah.
And you know, Bon Hilliard did a lot of interviews on the ground in New Hampshire. We saw a lot of the similar interviews in Iowa, where you did hear voters say, they're just bringing all these cases to stop him. And so as long as he's able to keep the narrative going that all of the volume of cases is not because he's a criminal, it's because the establishment, the swamp, wants him out so badly that they, some amorphous they, are bringing all of these cases. In their mind, it negates all of them.
And can I jump on that? I mean, I think Joy's right, and whether we like it or not, this may be something that is a big part of the next few months of debate, depending on what happens with these cases. And I think you're right that there's only two responses when you're faced with serious accusations. I didn't do it. Or everybody does it.
Right.
And a certain amount of political... Or both. Which is... and a certain amount of political attacks, people say, oh, more things come up and more things are hurled around in campaigns up to a point. I don't think that gets Donald Trump off, but that can be appealing up to a point. Everybody does it. Everybody's got things being thrown around. But I didn't do it is also important here in the sense that his entire message and claims around the election, what Fox had to pay out $700 million for and doesn't want to air, and what a lot of the real world knows is a lie, right? He can't go back to that. It's all connected. And so if there's
he argues, I'm allowed to do it. Right? Shamelessness is his superpower, right? You can never hold him to what he said yesterday or today, because he'll change his tune tomorrow and look you square in the eye. That's his super skill.
And by the way, you know what he's never said? I didn't do it. He just says, right. I mean, so the bottom line is,
well, I'm saying
with
with some of these cases, it's I didn't do it, and with the coup and the election denial, it's not only I did it, it's I'm allowed to do it, I have immunity, and let's go forward. And I do think that's important because that sort of goes back to what do you think is happening here, and can you convince enough people? Tom Wolfe had the line, and other people have used it, basically a conservative becomes a liberal once they're arrested. And the number of people who've suddenly discovered on the right that they have questions about the evidence standard or due process or being set up right. This is a thing that marginalized communities and other people who have been thrust into the justice system have dealt with forever. Now all of a sudden everybody's worried about that. And so he plays on that. But again, to your original question, does it raise, make no difference, or lower his standing if these things accrue? I think it lowers it.
Our coverage of New Hampshire, the primary, and the road ahead. Tomorrow's going to be a very, very interesting day. That will continue after the break. Be right back. All right, so we are in the midst of a nominating contest, and we've got some news about what's coming up next. All right, so hear me out here. February 8th, the Republicans are going to hold caucuses in both Nevada and the U.S. Virgin Islands. But there's a really strange situation in Nevada. Nevada's Republican Party, you may have heard the news about this, is a little bit messy right now, partly because its chairman has been criminally indicted for his part in the Trump fake elector scheme in 2020. And as a result of that chaos and a sort of vacuum leadership, what appears to be an effort by the party to make sure Trump wins Nevada no matter what else is happening, the Nevada Republicans are going to hold that caucus on February 8th, which will be run by the Republican Party. But then there will also be a traditional primary, which will be run by the state, but which is described as non-binding. You got all that? Of the candidates who are left, Donald Trump is participating in the caucus on February 8th. Nikki Haley is participating in the primary 2 days prior. You got to pick one. So I don't know what to do with that. No one really does. After that is the next, contest we're sure about. It's Nikki Haley's home state of South Carolina, which will hold its primary contest, as South Carolina always does, on a Saturday on February 24th. So the Nevada thing's weird. The one thing that's interesting to me here is about the length of time. You've got a month.
Yeah.
And we've seen before sometimes momentum gets rolling and a ba-ba-ba-ba-ba cadence helps the candidate that's winning. We saw this, of course, in 2020, coming out of South Carolina into Super Tuesday, which was that Saturday was South Carolina, and Super Tuesday, which included California, was 3 days later. And that was enormously consequential for Joe Biden, who won South Carolina, and then it was like, whoosh, next thing you know, the country shuts down, COVID, Joe Biden nominee, boom, we're done, right? You don't have anything like that here.
That is legit what happened.
That is legit what happened. It happened so fast. It was like, what is even going on? Stephanie, you've got a month, which is weird, right? It's a long amount of time. I generally would think that's going to help the person who's leading.
Potentially, or, and again, I realize the math, I realize that it's hard to see a map. Could you see the dormant George Bush Republicans that we hear about all the time, who are, disgruntled, disappointed, say, here's our shining white light. It's Nikki Haley. Let's get the troop back together and get behind her. Maybe this is happening once in a million. If there's anybody who's going to give them a shot, right? If they can't possibly make the argument that Republican Party still exists if they all don't get behind Nikki Haley with full force right now. Because if they don't, you have given your party to Donald Trump. Say it, pray it, you did it.
And the problem with that is that if you look at the structural makeup of the Republican Party in South Carolina, it's even more white evangelical than Iowa. And so she's going to go home to a state that's built much more like Iowa than New Hampshire. There's very few independent voters. It's a closed primary. She literally, there is almost no scenario where I can imagine her winning her home state, which is usually the end, right?
That's the end.
That's the end. And then she's got Tim Scott, who she appointed to the Senate, who humiliated himself and debased himself for Donald Trump tonight, and who's with him. It's such a mess, but I think rhetorically she should ride into South Carolina. But the question is, does she actually participate in that primary and embarrass herself with a loss?
The first big question is, does she make it a month under the pressure she's going to be under? Does the money stay there, which is also going to be a question. But there's a universe in which one could imagine an alternate form of politics, and I think prior...
You're living in it.
Well, prior to this, you could say, look, this is someone who had pretty high approval ratings in the state when she was there, who was the governor of the state, and in the alternate universe I'm imagining, sort of pre-Trump or alternate to Trump universe, you're going to go camp out in your home state for a month and rely on the political connections there. That's just not the world we live in right now.
Trump has the endorsements of the two sitting South Carolina senators, Lindsey Graham and Tim Scott. And Trump can do apparently anything to Tim Scott, humiliate him on the national stage, and the response is, I love you more.
Dude, the wildest thing is Nancy Mace. You seen that? Nancy Mace turned against Trump, invited a primary challenge backed by Trump, was saved at the last minute by an endorsement by none other than Nikki Haley, and is now endorsing Trump.
There is no red line for the Republican Party and for South Carolina. The other problem, Chris, is that Nikki Haley is effectively running against her record as governor in a lot of ways, right? She's not talking about her signal moments as governor. She doesn't want to be that person anymore, so it's hard to, hard to curry favor with those surprise supporters.
Is she going to run around with her multiracial family and show them off? That is not the thing she can even do. And she's saying that, slavery and racism, she's doubting that at this point.
All right, so the takeaway for tonight is Trump won, Biden won, Haley vowed to fight on a month from now in her home state. The results are in for the 2024 New Hampshire primary. The race to the White House is really just beginning. MSNBC special coverage continues after this break with Jen Psaki at the helm from Manchester, New Hampshire. Do not go anywhere.